Welcome to the audiobook of Fowl Play by P.A. Mason, a new cozy fantasy mystery in the Gretchen's New Adventures series. Chapter 1. The shop bell jingled merrily above the door, doing little to soothe Gretchen's nerves as she managed the morning rush solo. Mirkwood Medicinals was packed tighter than a goblin's coin purse, the air thick with the scents of rosemary, lavender, and desperation. "And it's got this, tick," the man said, stroking his scraggly beard with a tremor in his hand, like it's trying to crawl right off me face. Gretchen plastered on a smile that she hoped was convincing. "Haunted beard, you say?" He nodded emphatically. "Tried an exorcism, and it didn't take. The barber refuses to go near it. Says he's allergic to ghosts." Gretchen thought the barber's scruples were more about the man than the beard. The things people came up with. Still, business was business. "Well, lucky for you, I've got just the thing." She turned, pushing aside a jar of pickled gizzards to reach for a cloudy bottle labeled D-Hair. After setting it on the counter and uncorking the serum, Gretchen rummaged in a drawer to fish out a smaller vial and a pair of tweezers. The man leaned closer to give the concoction a sniff, and Gretchen seized the opportunity to pluck a gray hair from the bird's nest he called a beard. She had to bite back a smirk as he stepped backward in shock, jostling the next customer in line. "What did you do that for?" he hissed. "You don't want to lose your eyebrows, do you?" Gretchen clucked as she pushed the hair into the vial and poured a small amount of serum over the top before corking it. With a bit of magical oomph, she gave the concoction a shake, causing the hair to fizzle into bright blue bubbles. "That'll be 5 silver. 3 for the serum, and another 2 as danger money. It's not every day that I need to put my neck on the line, angering specters living in beards." The man stroked his beard and reached for his purse, his wide eyes suggesting that he was unsure if Gretchen was mocking him. But he thumped the silver on the counter before snatching the potion, so Gretchen figured she'd handled it okay. She was about to serve the next customer in line when she caught sight of a woman with a feathered hat perched precariously on her head, vigorously shaking a bottle of bright pink liquid near the window. "Hey," Gretchen called, "I wouldn't shake that if I were you. It's liable to take your arm off." The woman wrinkled her nose, the feathers on her hat trembling. "If it's so dangerous, why do you keep it out here then?" She continued to agitate the bottle, her movements growing more dramatic as she did so. Gretchen winced. Some people, she thought, just couldn't be helped. She opened her mouth to offer a firmer warning, but before she could utter a word, a streak of purple leapt from a shelf and darted between the woman's legs. She shrieked, and the bottle dropped to the floor. The telltale tinkle of shattered glass set Gretchen's teeth on edge, and she wasn't surprised when a geyser of iridescent pink bubbles erupted from the floor and engulfed the woman in a frothy cloud. My word. A startled yelp came from a man clutching a poultice to his cheek. He backed away, bumping into a woman with a basket full of eggs. The eggs tumbled to the floor, potions clattered, and within seconds, the shop was in an uproar. "Get back," Gretchen cried, but her pleas were lost in the panic. She ducked out from the counter as the woman with the feathered hat squealed at Mulligan, who had chosen that precise moment to leap, with his claws leading, to catch one of hundreds of bubbles floating toward the ceiling. 2 bottles, one a vibrant green, the other a putrid yellow, sailed through the air, their contents colliding in a spectacular burst of rainbow-colored foam. The shop filled with a deafening hiss and a truly unholy stench, like a troll's armpit after a 3-day hike. Customers fled into the street, coughing and sputtering. Gretchen watched in horror and relief as the last of the chaos trailed out the door. Mulligan, the architect of this disaster, sat smugly among the wreckage, licking a stray bubble from his whiskers. "You!" Gretchen scooped him up, her voice a low growl. He purred innocently, nuzzling against her cheek. She deposited him none too gently into his basket by the hearth. "Don't you even try it, you furry little menace. Just stay put and try not to destroy anything else, you hear?" Heaving a sigh, Gretchen surveyed the damage. Broken glass, spilled potions, and enough foam to drown a small dragon. She wafted charm-smelling salts at the bubbling mess to dispel the stench. Propping the front door open, she grabbed a broom, muttering about the joys of owning a familiar with a penchant for chaos. After sweeping the worst of the mess out into the cobbled gutter, she approached the counter, where a lone young man with a nervous twitch in his eye waited patiently. "I've never seen a purple cat before," he offered with an anxious chuckle before brushing some stray foam from his sleeve. As you can see, he doesn't have much by way of self-preservation skills, Gretchen said, forcing a smile. He was ginger once, until he got a little too close to a cooling cauldron when he was just a whippersnapper. Now, what can I do for you? The man described his troubles in a shaky voice, mentioning an overenthusiastic rooster ruining his mornings and causing him no small measure of frustration. Gretchen nodded sympathetically at the plight of the poor man tossing on his pillow as a result of his feathery tormentor. A basic sleeping potion should do the trick, she said, reaching for a nondescript jar on the shelf. 1 drop in his water dish should keep him from crowing until noon. The man held up a finger with a frown. I thought perhaps it was me who should use the potion. Hey, suit yourself. My potions are equally effective for people and poultry. As she measured a dose of the sleeping brew, Gretchen noticed Piper in the corner of her eye. Her young ward, wearing the insignia of the Witches' Academy on her robe, stood by the door. She fiddled with her necklace while biting her lip, her eyes darting around at the chaotic aftermath of Mulligan's rampage. Gretchen stifled a sigh. Trust Piper to drop in while the shop was a mess. But Piper met her eye with a hopeful wave, and Gretchen gave the kid a surreptitious nod as she finished mixing the man's order. After giving the guy instructions on dosage, he paid in silver, and Piper scuttled out of the doorway as he turned to leave. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, Gretchen turned to face her ward, who shifted from foot to foot. "What is it, kid?" Gretchen asked, leaning over the counter. Piper hesitated, taking a deep breath. Well, I need your help with something." Gretchen raised her eyebrows. There wasn't much the kid needed help with these days while mastering her magic at the academy, and usually her experiments and thirst for knowledge led her to the library to pore over obscure texts. She knew the budding witch didn't care for her slapdash approach to sorcery, so if there was a problem, it had to be about something other than study. "Sure, kid. Lay it on me." Piper rummaged in her satchel and drew out a slender stick gingerly. Holding it between 2 fingers, she took a deep breath. "I think someone is playing a prank on me. Yesterday I enchanted this wand to turn ribbons into flowers, just like Mistress Mendel asked, but now," Piper swallowed, "it's turning everything into chickens." "Chickens?" Gretchen scoffed, heading toward the door so she could snip the lock. "You mean you somehow enchanted a chicken wand?" "I didn't enchant it." Piper's face twisted in indignation. "Yesterday it was working perfectly. Roses in all shades, depending on the color of the ribbon." Gretchen flipped the closed sign on the door and rubbed her jaw as she stared at the innocuous-looking wand in Piper's hand. "You know, I don't remember ever enchanting a wand at school in my day. Seems a little foolhardy for a group of girls your age, if you ask me." "It's an advanced class," Piper said. "Mistress Mendel offered to take me into the senior group." Gretchen whistled through her teeth. After spending a year at the academy, Piper had finally caught up to the age regular witches enrolled. That she was already mixing with the seniors was a testament, not only to her strength, which is why she started early, but also her bookish tendencies. "And you're sure we're talking chickens? Maybe those roses of yours sprouted feathers instead of petals by mistake." Piper huffed, her cheeks turning pink. "They're chickens, Gretchen. Real live chickens. The ones that lay eggs, not roses." She brandished the wand with a dramatic flourish. "I'll show you." Before Gretchen could stop her, Piper pointed the wand toward a Hessian sack of beans leaning against the wall. "Rosa Verto," she cried, her voice echoing in the quiet shop. A flicker of purple fur caught Gretchen's eye. Mulligan shot out from under the counter, tail twitching. He darted across the floor, directly into the path of the wand's magic just as Piper finished the incantation. There was a blinding flash of light, followed by a startled yowl that morphed into a shrill squawk. Gretchen shielded her eyes, a static dance of energy causing the hair on the back of her neck to stand on end. As the light faded, an eerie silence settled over the shop. Gretchen blinked, her vision slowly adjusting. She stared at the spot where Mulligan had been, her jaw slowly dropping open. In his place stood a plump, purple rooster, its feathers ruffled in confusion. The bird let out a pitiful cluck, turning its head from side to side, as if trying to make sense of its surroundings. "Mulligan," Gretchen whispered, her voice trembling. She took a tentative step forward, reaching a hand toward the transformed creature. "Is that you, Furball?" Piper stood frozen, the wand still clutched in her hand. Her face became ashen, and her eyes were wide with shock. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her words trailing off. Mulligan let out a startled squawk as his new wings stretched, knocking a stack of empty potion bottles off the shelf behind him with a crash. He hopped back, shaking his purple plumage and sending a cascade of glass shards across the floor. Gretchen winced, but before she could reckon with what would break next, the rooster took off running. He dashed between her legs, his feathers tickling her ankles. "Mulligan," Gretchen cried, scrambling after him. "Get back here, you feathered fiend." The rooster, however, had other plans. He flapped his wings with surprising strength, knocked over a basket of dried herbs, and sent a cloud of pungent dust into the air. He careened into a shelf laden with jars of pickled whatsits, narrowly avoiding another disaster. Gretchen coughed, waving her hands in front of her face to clear the air as she chased after him. "Mulligan, stop this instant," she yelled, her voice hoarse. The cat rooster didn't listen. He weaved between Gretchen's legs again, then launched himself into the air. He flapped his wings frantically, grasping the edge of a stack of crates before launching himself upward again. Gretchen tried to grab a taloned claw as he worked his way overhead but missed, as he sprung again and landed with an indignant squawk on top of a tall shelf at the back of the shop. From his perch, he glared down at them with beady, rooster eyes. "I'm so sorry, Gretchen," Piper whimpered, twisting the wand between her fingers. "I didn't mean to turn Mulligan into a, Gretchen held up a hand to silence the girl, her eyes fixed on the transformed familiar perched precariously on a shelf groaning under the weight of a dozen heavy books. "And you said something about this being a prank?" she asked, her voice tight. Piper nodded solemnly. "I swear, it was working fine yesterday. And I don't think the girls in the senior class were happy when Mistress Mendel brought me along last week. Some of them are mean. I'm sure they want to see me fail." Gretchen opened and closed her fists and smacked her lips, trying to hold on to whatever composure she could. "And you came to me instead of Cordelia? Why?" Piper set the wand carefully on the counter and took a moment before responding. "I don't have any proof. If I say anything, they'll only tell her I shouldn't be in that class anyway, that I'm trying to blame them for messing up the enchantment. Besides, you told me I shouldn't put up with bullies, that I should give as good as I get." Gretchen frowned at the girl, who usually brushed off her advice when it came to academy survival skills, and so far she hadn't needed to play hardball, as far as Gretchen knew. But an exceptional student who packed more power than an entire class combined had to earn a target on their back at some point in their academic career. With one last lingering look at Rooster Mulligan, who had begun pecking at his newfound feathers, Gretchen took a stealing breath and decided on a course of action. "You did right, kid, you did right." Piper's shoulders sagged in relief, but when she opened her mouth, Gretchen held up a silencing finger and made her way to the stairs leading to the mezzanine level. Upstairs, the sparse furnishings of her midweek boudoir left little to hide, in contrast to the cramped shelves in the shop. Even when traveling to and from Edgewater, she and Piper called home, Gretchen always brought her spellbook along and took care to stash it out of sight in the city. She had little faith in the local constabulary, so when she shifted a chest of drawers, it took some doing to pry away 3 loose bricks to where the Mirkwood grimoire was secreted away. "You'll turn Mulligan back?" Piper asked from behind her. "Are you kidding?" Gretchen scoffed as she pushed herself off the floor, much to the disgust of her creaking joints. "Did I never tell you about the time Nora and I had to turn a frog into a prince on a little island called Sharon? It was a nightmare. The best I could do was turn a lizard into a frog, and even Nora messed up that little transformation tincture when it came time to bust out of a foreign prison. No, the best I can hope for is that the enchantment wears off quickly, or I might need to enlist an expert to set him right." Piper cocked her head. "Nora?" Maybe," Gretchen said dismissively as she carted the tome downstairs with Piper trailing behind her. "But she's away uncursing a painting in some backwater town to the east. Besides, this is Mulligan we're talking about. Nora might have a certain amount of expertise with antiques, but I don't think I'd put that cat's fate in the hands of just anyone now, would I?" Piper hurried around the counter as Gretchen set the spellbook down, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Then why have you brought that out?" Gretchen blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. "Huh?" she snorted, as if the answer was blatantly obvious. "What do you think this is, some kind of cookbook? I don't just use it for healing potions and antidotes, you know. This," she patted the book's worn cover, is a Mirkwood family legacy, passed down from witch to witch, chock full of every pranking spell and hex my ancestors ever cooked up. She grinned, a mischievous glint in her eye. And let me tell you, the Mirkwoods have always had a flair for the dramatic. But Gretchen, Piper exclaimed, I don't want to prank them back, I want the pranks to stop. Nonsense. Gretchen flipped open the heavy book, its blank pages promising a world of sorcery as Gretchen's thrumming fingers conjured eager ink stains beneath them. That's not how pranks work. Think those academy girls will find chicken wands so funny when their boots are filled with slime every time they put them on, she muttered, more to herself than Piper, or when their precious hair starts falling out in clumps. No, Piper squeaked. That won't help at all. I came to you because I wanted help to prove they meddled with my wand. Then I won't fail Mistress Mendel's class and be forced to go back to the juniors. Gretchen's eyebrows furrowed as she tried to put herself in Piper's shoes. If given a choice back in her days at the academy, Gretchen had always preferred to prove herself to her peers rather than her teachers, much to the disgust of the teaching faculty. But that was who she was, and as Piper's guardian, Gretchen knew she had to support the kid on her own path, even if it felt foreign to her own. Fine, she sighed. We'll do it your way. I can uncover plots just as well as devise them. But once you've got the all clear and passed this test of yours, I expect you to line their sheets with itching powder at the very least, you hear. Chapter 2. Piper paced the confines of the shop as Gretchen studied the spellbook, and after fetching a dustpan and broom to sweep shattered glass, she paused to frown. Where's Wren? Gretchen couldn't tear her eyes from the page, and it took a moment for the answer to form on her lips. Oh, I sent him to Edgewater to go foraging for ingredients. A supplier of mine hiked his prices a couple of weeks ago, so I decided it would be easier to send the little miscreant off to the woods to collect them. Jurgen will bring him back in a few days, and hopefully time with Nellie will improve his mood. He's been downright lippy lately. Piper bent to sweep the mess with a dubious look. I doubt he'll be happy to find all this when he gets back. Nonsense. He's a brownie. A mess is what he needs. Once everything is spick and span, the attitude kicks in. Trust me. I think he'll have a fit if he comes back to find chicken scratchings all over his polished floors. Piper mumbled. What was that? Nothing. Gretchen grunted, flipping through the spellbook, but then the tome let out a loud, irritated squawk and slapped itself shut. Oh, really? Gretchen snapped, glaring at the book. You take offense to the mess too, do you? The book flopped over, then righted itself, stubbornly closed. Gretchen huffed and rubbed at her temples. All right, I'm coming. Hold your horses. She pushed herself out of her chair, wincing as her knees popped. Right, Piper, hand me that dustpan, would you? Piper paused in her sweeping, glancing nervously at Mulligan, who had taken to leaping from shelf to shelf, his new form apparently granting him just as much aptitude for acrobatics. A basket of dried herbs tumbled to the ground, and Piper sidestepped to avoid the cascading leaves. Maybe we should put him outside, or in a box or something. He keeps knocking things down. Let him be. It'll give Wren an excuse to clean the place from top to bottom when he gets back. Speaking of Wren, a slow grin spread across her face as an idea formed. She whirled, nearly tripping over the bag of beans which had been Piper's earlier target. I've got it. Got what? Piper asked, her brow furrowed as she watched Gretchen rummage through a drawer. What have you got? The culprit. I know how we're going to catch them, Gretchen said triumphantly, pulling a small vial from the drawer and holding it up. A bright red liquid swirled inside, almost fluorescent in the morning light. What is that? Piper squinted at the vial. It looks like red-handed potion, Gretchen said with a flourish. A classic, really. Wren always puts a little on the door handle when he's away from the shop. It's easy. We set a little trap in your dormitory, and anyone who tries to touch your stuff will find themselves with a rather noticeable souvenir. You mean Piper's nose wrinkled? Their hands will turn red? Gretchen chuckled. Bright red. They'll practically glow in the dark. It'll be impossible to miss. I don't know, Gretchen, Piper hesitated. Isn't that just stooping to their level? It's just a little mean, don't you think? Mean? Gretchen's eyebrows shot up. They sabotaged your wand, Piper. Red hands are the least of what they deserve. Still. Piper cleared her throat, Whoever it is, they've already done the deed. They won't have any reason to return to the scene of the crime. Maybe. Gretchen set the red-handed potion down to sweep the herbs with a grimace, the damp, foamy floors already turning the leaves into mush. Who do you think is behind this, anyway? Murray, Piper said firmly. It has to be Murray Goldworthy. Gretchen grunted, tossing the herbs into the bin. Another Goldworthy girl? They breed like darn rabbits. But why her? Piper's lips twisted. Well, she's the only one who you know. Who what? Gretchen straightened, groaning as her back protested the movement. Who always tries to get ahead. Piper wrung her hands. She's the top of the class, and she complained the most when Mistress Mendel explained that I'd be joining them. She only ever looks down her nose at me, and made a fuss of saying I would never keep up with the senior girls. The Goldworthys, Gretchen mused, rubbing the small of her back. Always a proud bunch, that clan. Ambitious, the lot of them. Used to dabble in a bit of everything, if I recall. Potions, charms, even a touch of dark magic. Back in the day. You remember what happened with that headless horseman, don't you? Piper swallowed and nodded warily. So, what are we going to do? Gretchen frowned, her gaze sweeping the shop. Well, if it's proof you want, it's proof you'll get. But the potion. Piper gestured to the vial Gretchen still held. Never mind that. Gretchen shook her head, returning the vial into the drawer. Figuring out who the culprit is one thing. Spell-wise, it should be easier to find the evidence if we already know who's behind it. Did you hear that, you lousy stack of paper? Gretchen directed the latter a little louder at the counter, where the spellbook jerked indignantly. Its cover remained stubbornly closed, however, and Piper sighed. Have you got a potion for that too? She asked. Gretchen fussed over a shelf which remained coated in foam and clucked dismissively. You know as well as I do that personal potions require something personal. While we wait for the spellbook to wake up properly, we should really head to the academy and sneak into this girl's dormitory. We can't, Piper said. If we're caught. Come on, you came to me because you needed an outsider solution, Gretchen said and pointed out the window. It's barely past 9, which means all your fellow pupils will be in classes. It'll be, Gretchen frowned and worked her jaw. But hold on, why aren't you in class? Piper bit her lip as she bent to pick up a wayward wicker basket off the floor. I told Mistress Thorne that I was feeling ill before breakfast. A slow smile spread over Gretchen's face. You know, that sounds awfully close to truancy to me. Piper's cheeks bloomed bright red. I didn't know what else to do. Hey, I'm not complaining. It's nice to see you taking the odd risk from time to time. The trick is to know when it's worth it. Gretchen made a face, which was never something I excelled at. Piper snickered, and Gretchen was glad to see the worry lift off her shoulders, at least for a moment. Mulligan aside, she would do anything to protect the girl, and had fretted right from the start about how she would fare in the witch world of the academy. Gretchen's gaze drifted toward Mulligan, roosting on top of a shelf, his purple feathers ruffled as he surveyed them with beady eyes. Right then, she announced, clapping her hands together. We'll need to take you with us. Furball, or is it featherball these days? Piper's jaw dropped. Take him to the academy? Like this? Don't look at me like that, Gretchen said. Can't very well leave him behind, can we? Who knows what kind of trouble he'll get into? But Gretchen, Piper wailed, he's a chicken. Won't that arouse suspicion? Trust me, I've smuggled in worse back in my day. Gretchen tapped her nose with a smirk. What about Harriet Hawthorne? She's still the familiar caretaker, isn't she? Mistress Harriet, I guess so, but... We'll say that we're bringing in this poor creature that I inadvertently turned purple, Gretchen said, more to herself than Piper. She's always had a soft spot for strays, even the feathered variety. A flicker of hope crossed Piper's face, quickly replaced by a look of alarm. Gretchen, what if he starts crowing while we're sneaking around? It won't be a problem if the dormitories are empty, and if he's that much of a problem, I'll drop him off to Harriet for real while you do the snooping. Piper didn't appear convinced, but Gretchen bustled toward the back of the shop, muttering to herself about obstinate roosters. She emerged a moment later, a large butterfly net in hand, one she usually reserved for catching moths and butterflies for her more potent concoctions. But first comes the hard part. Be a doll and go upstairs to fetch my basket, won't you? We can fasten the lid so he doesn't escape. Piper glanced between Gretchen and the cat rooster, then scurried to the mezzanine level. Gretchen had mostly sent her off so she didn't fall prey to a tumbling jar. and steeled herself for the challenge of snaring her familiar. "Hold still, you feathered fiend." Gretchen brandished the butterfly net, her patience wearing thin. Mulligan flapped his wings from his vantage and cocked his head, weighing his options with ruffled feathers. "Don't even think about it." Gretchen followed his gaze. The last thing she needed was a repeat of the herb incident, or worse, tumbling jars full of volatile ingredients. Mulligan, as if sensing her thoughts, let out a defiant squawk and took a flying leap, not toward the safety of the floor, but at a hanging cluster of dried herbs. Gretchen winced as leaves and flower buds rained down. "You're lucky you're already purple, you mangy," Gretchen lunged, swinging the net wildly. Mulligan dodged with surprising agility, having adjusted to his new form with surprising ease. "All right, have it your way." She clambered onto a stool, muttering about the indignity of chasing a chicken through her own shop. The stool wobbled precariously beneath her weight, but she maintained her balance, lunging at Mulligan with the net outstretched. He let out a startled squawk as the net engulfed his feathered form, wings flapping furiously. Gretchen, with a triumphant yell, wrestled the net free, sending a burst of purple feathers around them in an obscene cloud. "Got you." "I'm coming," Piper's voice called from the top of the stairs, just as Gretchen detangled Mulligan from the net by the legs. He struggled in her grasp, squawking and pecking at her hands. "About time." Gretchen wrestled him toward the basket Piper deposited on the floor. "Help me stuff him in here before he has a fit." With Piper's help, Gretchen stuffed Mulligan inside, slamming the lid shut just as he gave another ear-splitting squawk. After finding a piece of string to secure the basket, Mulligan gave up jostling and instead chirruped away menacingly. "You're bleeding," Piper said as Gretchen finished the knot. "That's cockerels for you." Gretchen wiped her bloodied hand on her drab-black dress. "But even in cat form, Mulligan's given me plenty of scrapes over the years. Take those cauldrons off the heat and let's get going." It didn't take the pair long to set the shop into some semblance of order and to tamp down the fire with a bucket of ash. Gretchen had to shoo potential customers from the door as they emerged, promising to be back later when they insisted their malady couldn't wait. "Right, that's the windows shuttered and door bolted," Gretchen said, checking the locks one last time. She hefted the basket higher on her shoulder, wincing as Mulligan shifted inside with a muffled squawk. You'd think with all that flapping he'd be tired out by now. Piper, who stood by the door and nervously fiddled with the straps of her satchel, shot Gretchen a worried look. "Are you sure about this?" "Relax, would you? It's not like we're smuggling in a pixie." Although Gretchen thought to herself she'd done that once, too. And a rather disagreeable pixie it had been, if she recalled correctly. Not that she planned on telling Piper about that little escapade. "Besides," Gretchen said, adjusting her pointed witch's hat, "Harriet's seen it all. A purple chicken won't even make her blink." With one last glance around, Gretchen ushered Piper into the bustling heart of Helgard. The morning rush had subsided somewhat, but the cobblestone streets were still crowded with merchants hawking their wares, children darting between legs, and the occasional carriage rattling over the uneven stones. Gretchen, used to navigating the crowded streets, weaved through the throng with practiced ease. Piper followed more cautiously behind her. The basket bumped against Gretchen's hip as she walked, likely causing Mulligan's muffled chirps. "Try to be a little less conspicuous, will you?" she hissed at the basket. The only response was an indignant squawk. As they made their way through the city, Gretchen's stomach growled at the scent of fresh bread and spices vying with the less pleasant odors of the city. With Wren away, she'd missed breakfast that morning, something which she hoped to remedy on the way into the Witches' Academy by taking the back door into the kitchens. The building eventually loomed ahead, its imposing stone walls a stark contrast to the colorful chaos of the rest of the street. Gretchen took Piper's elbow to slip into the alleyway before they reached the main entrance, and the girl hunched over like she was fleeing a crime scene. "Ready?" Gretchen asked, glancing at Piper. Piper cast her wary eyes around the alley but squared her shoulders and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." Gretchen grinned at the startled faces of the kitchen staff as she waltzed through with Piper in tow. They were used to her impromptu visits by now, though the cooks usually shooed her away before she could get close to the large vats over the hearth. She snagged a couple of still warm buns from a basket, tossing one to a wide-eyed kitchen boy who scrambled to catch it, and taking a bite out of the other. "Just passing through. Off to see Harriet, you know how it is." She shot them a wink, hoping they wouldn't comment on the way the basket she carried on her shoulder trembled ominously. "Morning, Miss Mirkwood," one cook greeted her, her tone wary as she eyed the basket. "What you got in there, then? Something to go in the girl's stew?" "Just a little something I'm hoping Harriet can help me with." Gretchen winked again, hoping her smile didn't look as strained as it felt. "Poor thing's got a bit of a cough." As if on cue, Mulligan chose that moment to let out a particularly loud squawk. Gretchen stifled a groan and clapped a hand over her mouth, pretending to sneeze. "Excuse me," she said, ushering Piper toward the door. The kitchen boy only laughed and returned to scoffing his bun. They slipped through the door, into the maze-like hallways of the academy and up the stairs, leaving the clatter of pots and pans behind them. The scent of old books and something vaguely floral permeated every surface. Gretchen navigated the corridors with practiced ease, the portraits of witches long since dead and buried guiding their way. "Just a few more flights of stairs," she said to Piper, who trailed behind, her creeping gait laden with apprehension. They passed a gaggle of younger students, their robes askew and faces smeared with something that looked suspiciously like soot. Piper shrunk against the wall guiltily, but one of them, a scrawny girl with a mop of ginger hair, caught sight of Gretchen and let out a startled yelp. "Don't worry, kiddos," Gretchen said. "Nobody will hear it from me. Carry on with your, whatever it is you're doing." The students mumbled something unintelligible and hurried away, casting curious glances over their shoulders at Piper. "They'll tell Mistress Thorne I'm out of bed," Piper said, her voice urgent. "Don't you worry about that. I'll tell Edna that I insist on tending to whatever malady you conjured up myself," Gretchen said, steering them around a corner and into a narrow passageway, "so she can keep her big nose out of it." Piper gasped at that, but Gretchen only smirked as she pressed onward. They finally reached an intersection, one path leading toward the dormitories, the other to Harriet's office. Gretchen paused, considering their options, and that's when it happened. A loud, insistent squawk erupted from the basket, echoing through the hallway. Gretchen winced, her shoulders slumping. "Oh, for crying out loud. That confounded bird," Gretchen said with a grimace. The muffled clucks emanating from the basket sounded suspiciously like laughter. Piper winced and glanced down both paths, bouncing from foot to foot. "Maybe you were right," Gretchen said, lowering the basket. "How about you head to Muri's dorm, and I'll drop this feathered menace off with Harriet? Less chance of anyone noticing you that way." Piper's hand latched onto Gretchen's wrist, her eyes wide and panicked. "Please, Gretchen, don't make me go alone." Gretchen sighed. She knew how much courage this was taking for the girl and couldn't very well fault her for nerves. Of course, she thought it would look even stranger if they were caught together sneaking around accompanied by a purple rooster, no less, but at least Gretchen was prepared to shoulder the blame. All right, you win." She gave Piper's hand a reassuring squeeze and glared at the basket. "And you, one more peep and it's chicken pie for dinner. Understood?" A muffled thump suggested Mulligan had gotten the message. Hopefully. Gretchen adjusted her grip on the basket, and with a last encouraging nod, they set off down the corridor toward the senior girls' dormitories. The hallway was eerily silent, the only sound the soft thud of their footsteps on the worn timber floor. Gretchen kept her ears sharp for the sound of coughing or other signs that there were other ill students lingering, and Piper navigated to the correct door. The dormitory was surprisingly spacious, with high ceilings and large windows letting in shafts of pale sunlight. Of course, Gretchen had dropped out of the academy before she ascended to the seniors' class. Her faded memories of cramped quarters contrasted with the scene in front of them. 4 beds, each draped with heavy velvet curtains for privacy, were arranged around the room. Various trunks, hat boxes, and discarded textbooks littered the floor, a testament to the chaos of angsty teenage witches. They were halfway across the room when approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Gretchen froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Quick, the beds," Piper gestured frantically. Grateful that the velvet curtains offered her a more dignified hiding spot, Gretchen lugged the basket into a bed and drew the curtain closed, just as Piper dove underneath another bed. Chapter 3. Gretchen held her breath as the harried footsteps approached, the basket clutched tightly against her chest. Mulligan shifted restlessly inside, and she silently willed him to stay quiet. The dormitory door burst open, and a flash of black robes swept by the crack in the curtains. A student rushed in, her straw-colored hair in disarray. "Come on, where is it?" she fretted, darting across the room toward a bed on the opposite wall. Gretchen held her breath as she watched the girl hastily snatch a book from her dresser and tuck it into her bag. She muttered under her breath, her brow furrowed in worry, then pulled what appeared to be a pocket watch from her robes. "Mistress Omberglade is going to have my head if I'm late again," the girl groaned, quickly straightening her robes before hurrying toward the door. Gretchen's shoulders sagged in relief, but then the girl paused, glancing around the room one last time. For a heart-stopping moment, Gretchen was certain she had spotted Piper under the next bed over. But then, with a resigned sigh, the girl turned and rushed out, the door slamming shut behind her. Gretchen waited a beat, straining to hear any other sounds from the hallway. When only silence greeted her, she drew the curtain to peer out. The room was empty, save for Piper's huddled form under the adjacent bed. "Coast is clear," Gretchen whispered, and Piper cautiously emerged, her face pale. "That was close," the girl said, glancing nervously at the door. Gretchen nodded, shifting the basket in her arms. "Too close. We'd better get a move on before someone else decides to make an appearance." She eased herself from the bed, wincing as her joints protested. "Remind me to bring a back brace the next time we go off adventuring. My body sure isn't what it used to be." Piper chuckled nervously, clearly unsure if talk of back braces was a joke, and Gretchen stifled a sigh. The girl wouldn't have an inkling about the indignity of old age, not for a good few decades yet. But Gretchen hoped the girl never had to experience bones creaking like a rusty hinge most days, despite a steady stream of potions keeping the worst of it at bay. Piper scrambled from underneath the bed with irksome ease, then looked around the room, her brow furrowed in concentration. Now to figure out which one is Murray's. "She mentioned something about a lucky hair ribbon she keeps in her top drawer," Piper said, more to herself than to Gretchen. "Said her aunt brought it back from the Eastern Isles. Apparently it shimmers with all the colors of a phoenix feather." "Hair ribbons and phoenix feathers," Gretchen muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "Young witches these days. Back in my time we were lucky if we had a spare cauldron to boil our underpants in." Gretchen pried open the basket's lid just enough to peek inside. Mulligan glared back at her, and took the opportunity to peck at her finger, causing her to drop the basket on the floor. "Fiend," Gretchen said as she shook her smarting finger, then used the tip of her boot to roll the basket across the floor in irritation. She had a mind to roll the rooster cat right down the hallway toward Harriet's office, but Piper's gasp forced Gretchen to forget the avian menace for a moment. "Look, Gretchen." She waved her hand urgently, peering into the top drawer of the dresser on the other side of the dormitory. Gretchen hurried to lean over Piper's shoulder, staring into the open drawer. "Well, well," she said, her voice laced with grim satisfaction. "What do we have here?" Nestled among neatly folded undergarments and a half-eaten bar of what looked suspiciously like chocolate, lay a wand. It was identical to Piper's own, right down to the swirling grain of the cherry wood. "See, I told you," Piper said, her eyes bright. "It's the same." "Is it, though?" Gretchen said, her gaze flickering toward the door before returning to the wand. A slow, wicked grin spread across her face. "Well, I guess we can't be sure until you give it a whirl. Go on, give it a try." Piper hesitated, her gaze darting between Gretchen and the wand. "But I don't have a ribbon with me." Gretchen let out a bark of laughter, and plucked the shimmering phoenix feather ribbon from the drawer to dangle it, enticingly in front of Piper's nose. "Well then, what better way to test it out than on something as exotic as this?" "Really?" Piper took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the ribbon. "I guess if there's nothing else to test it on." "Atta girl." A wicked smile spread on Gretchen's lips. Squaring her shoulders, Piper plucked the wand from the drawer and pointed it at the ribbon. "Rosa Verto," she said, her voice low but strong. With a flash, the shimmering ribbon transformed, the fibers twisting and melding together into a single, perfect rose. The petals gleamed with the burnished hues of a phoenix feather, shimmering with an otherworldly light. Gretchen's awe didn't last long, though. She soon realized a sharp thorn pierced the pad of her thumb where she'd been holding the ribbon just a moment before. She hissed in pain, quickly dropping the rose on the dresser and sticking her wounded finger in her mouth. "Blasted thing," she grumbled around her thumb, glaring at the innocent-looking flower. "Of course it sprouts a thorn in the most inconvenient place." But Gretchen, Piper stared at the wand with eyes as round as saucers. "This is my wand. I'm sure of it." "The old switcheroo, eh? But how can you be so sure?" "Mistress Mendel instructed us to enchant the wand to turn a ribbon into a flower. But I chose a rose. A rose with petals that matched the color of the ribbon. I'll bet none of the other girls thought of that. I got the idea when I was reading up on it in the library, and—" "Okay, fine," Gretchen said. "I believe you. Now put the chicken wand in that drawer and let's get the real deal out of here before someone else comes traipsing in. Yeah?" Piper's face twisted in confusion, and she blinked as her jaw hung open. "What?" "Switch them back," Gretchen said. "That old chestnut works a charm, believe you me. A good old dose of poetic justice." "No, I wouldn't do something like that." "Well, this Murray kid clearly isn't above doing that to you." "But then she'll only fail her test, and she'll know that I was behind it. It will start a war." Piper set the wand in the drawer and closed it resolutely. Gretchen blew a raspberry and shook her head. "And you think running off to tell the teachers won't? Come on, kid, I've been preparing you for this moment. It's time to give as good as you get. Girls like Murray need to figure out that picking on a Mirkwood incurs a hefty price." "Please, Gretchen. I want to do this the right way." Piper stared at Gretchen, her earnest eyes shining the way they always did shortly before Gretchen inevitably caved, and agreed to whatever it was she wanted. "Fine, we'll do it the hard way then," Gretchen said. "But that wand on its own isn't proof, you know. This Murray girl could just claim she enchanted it herself. It would be her word against yours." Piper pursed her lips and turned to the dresser to rummage around in the other drawers. Gretchen narrowed her eyes at the jostling basket across the room, but left Mulligan to his scratching while he was being quiet. Then Piper gave a triumphant yip as she pulled out a bundle of letters, and Gretchen glanced down with a questioning look. "Here, you start reading these. I'll check the notebooks." Gretchen grunted in response, prying the top letter loose. It was addressed to Murray in a flowing, elegant script, the ink a deep emerald green. She quickly scanned the first few lines, her brow furrowing. It was from the girl's aunt, Lenora Goldworthy. Gretchen had only met the woman a handful of times, but each encounter had left her with the distinct impression that Lenora Goldworthy considered herself several rungs higher on the social ladder than a humble potion maker like Gretchen Mirkwood, which she might have been, considering she was the matriarch of the family. Gretchen snorted, as if she'd have any interest in hobnobbing with the likes of the Goldworthys. They were a stuck-up bunch obsessed with bloodlines and ancient magic. Gretchen would choose a good, sturdy cauldron and a nice assortment of dried fungus over that hogwash any day. She continued reading, her lips pursed in distaste as Lenora's words swam before her eyes. The woman's usual brand of condescending encouragement dripped from every sentence, urging Murray to excel in her studies and maintain her family's prestigious standing at the academy. But then Gretchen's interest sharpened as she reached the last paragraph. "Remember, my dear," Lenora wrote, "you must remain at the top of your class, at whatever the cost. I have shown you the special enchantment, and I trust you will use it wisely. The Goldworthy legacy depends on it." Gretchen reread the passage, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. She nudged Piper with her elbow, shoving the letter into the girl's hand. "Read this." "What is it?" Piper glanced at the letter, her brow furrowed in concentration as she skimmed the contents. Gretchen watched as the girl's eyes widened, her lips moving silently as she absorbed the words. "What does she mean, at whatever the cost? And what special enchantment?" Gretchen frowned, glancing toward the basket where Mulligan had stopped trying to jostle his way out. Instead, the blasted rooster cat now emitted a soft, rhythmic clucking sound. "I don't like it," Gretchen said, ignoring Mulligan's incessant clucking. "This might be bigger than just Murray. The Goldworthys don't play nice, Piper. And it looks like they're willing to bend the rules to get what they want. Come on, let's look for a comb or something, grab a hair and scram. We'll figure out the rest back at the shop." As Piper folded the letter, Gretchen plucked it from her fingers before she could stash it away with the others, then slipped it into her pocket. It had only ever been a matter of time before Piper became the target of envious witches, but Gretchen figured if she'd earned the ire of the entire Goldsworthy clan, then this one mishap could be a lot worse than she first thought. Clenching her fist, she stared at the door, vowing silently to become Lenora's worst nightmare if it turned out she was behind this stunt. "Here," Piper said, wrinkling her nose as she held up an ivory comb with bright red hair tangled in its tines. "How many?" "Take it all," Gretchen said. That way you'll have enough to prank her with until she's old enough to need a straw with her soup." Piper raised her eyebrow but didn't argue as she pulled the strands free and deftly folded them into a scrap of paper. But she paused before slipping it into her satchel when an almighty screech sounded behind them. "What in tarnation?" Gretchen said, but then Mulligan burst from the basket, flapping and squawking with an indignant shriek. He tore across the room, a flurry of purple feathers and outraged clucking. "Mulligan," Piper scrambled after him, "get back here." "You'll be sorry you were ever hatched, you feathered feline," Gretchen roared, her threats drowned out by Mulligan's frantic squawking. She lunged for the rooster cat, but he was surprisingly nimble for a creature who'd been getting around on 4 legs just that morning. He dodged Piper's grab with a furious flap of his wings, sending a stack of textbooks tumbling to the floor. Gretchen cursed, tripping over a stray hairbrush as she gave chase. He was clearly enjoying this, the little monster. He'd get them both caught at this rate. "He's heading for the window," Piper shrieked, her voice laced with panic. Gretchen's blood ran cold. She hadn't even noticed that it was open when they'd snuck in. "Don't even think about it, you overgrown pigeon." But it was too late. Mulligan took a running leap, launching himself toward the open window with a triumphant squawk. Gretchen watched in horror as he squeezed through the narrow opening, his feathers brushing against the window frame. "He's gone," Piper cried, rushing to the window and leaning out. "Mulligan." Gretchen joined her, her heart thumping wildly enough to cause a cardiac arrest. She watched as Mulligan, a blur of purple against the gray sky, flapped his wings furiously, struggling to gain altitude. He headed toward the greenhouse, a sprawling glass structure that adjoined the dormitory building. "He's going to get himself killed," Gretchen said, fear twisting in her gut. The greenhouse was off limits to students outside of classroom hours, and for good reason. It housed all manner of rare and dangerous magical plants, some of which could turn a witch into a toadstool with a single touch. Her gaze followed Mulligan's erratic flight path. The rooster cat had landed, somewhat gracelessly, on the sloping glass roof of the greenhouse. He clung to the slippery surface, his claws scrabbling for purchase. "That blasted cat," she said, annoyed that he'd landed on the roof and relieved that he seemed to be in one piece. "How are we going to get him down from there?" "Come on, we need to get out to the grounds," Piper said, already halfway across the room. Gretchen didn't need telling twice. She snatched the basket and followed Piper, grumbling under her breath about the indignity of chasing a half-baked rooster cat across an academy full of stuck-up little snots. They rushed out of the dormitory room into the academy's labyrinthine hallways, their footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. "Slow down, would you?" Gretchen hissed, her knees protesting the unfamiliar exertion. "It's not like he can fly far." "Everyone will see, Gretchen, and imagine what those plants will do to him if he gets inside." Gretchen winced. Piper was right, of course. The greenhouse was dangerous. One wrong peck from a confused rooster cat, and anything could happen. They hurried down a winding staircase, Gretchen's hand gripping the worn banister for support. She stumbled on the last step, her ankle twisting beneath her. Blast it all. She hopped on one foot as she regained her balance. "I'm too old for schoolyard shenanigans." They burst out of the academy doors and onto the sprawling grounds, the midday sun warm on Gretchen's face. She shaded her eyes, scanning the area for any sign of the errant rooster cat. A cluster of students had gathered near the greenhouse, their voices a gaggle of amusement and concern, as they pointed toward the glass roof. Gretchen didn't need to guess what had captured their attention. "Mulligan," she roared, pushing her way through the throng of students. Her feathered familiar stood on the sloped glass, his purple plumage almost glowing in the sunlight. He peered at the assembled students, his head cocked to one side, letting out a series of indignant squawks. Gretchen swore she saw a flicker of smug satisfaction in those beady little eyes. Gretchen grimaced. The greenhouse shimmered under the sun, its glass panels reflecting the sky like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Her gaze darted around, searching for any point of entry that didn't involve shattering glass and alerting the entire academy to their presence. A sturdy-looking lattice structure, overgrown with flowering vines, caught her eye. It ran alongside the greenhouse wall, reaching almost to the roof. It wouldn't be the most graceful climb, but Gretchen had scaled more treacherous things in her day. She nudged a gawking student aside, her gaze fixed on the lattice. "Out of my way, kid. Witch coming through." Gretchen stepped closer to the lattice, testing its strength with the nudge of her boot. It seemed sturdy enough, the timber thick and weathered. But Piper caught her sleeve with an urgent hiss. "Look." Gretchen narrowed her eyes in the direction Piper pointed, recognizing the stout frame of Enola Elmsworth, even at that distance. As the Academy's resident expert on herbology, she also possessed an uncanny ability to appear at the most inconvenient moments. She crossed the green with arms pumping, a scowl twisting her features. "What in the light?" Enola pointed at Mulligan perched on the greenhouse roof. Gretchen pasted on a bright smile, hoping to distract the woman from her intended ascent. "Afternoon, Enola. Lovely day to be out in the garden?" She casually took a step back from the lattice, as if she'd simply been admiring the view. But before Mistress Elmsworth could comment on the strange sight of a purple interloper on top of her greenhouse, Mulligan took off. He launched himself into the air, flapping his wings with a desperate urgency that belied his earlier smugness. He veered sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a collision with a towering oak tree, and for a moment Gretchen dared to believe he might actually land on solid ground. She should have known better. With a strangled squawk, Mulligan grappled with the thick tangle of ivy growing over the looming academy walls. His taloned claws found enough purchase to spring up and over, and then he disappeared. Gretchen watched in muted horror, her stomach plummeting. The damn bird was heading into the city, and if he wasn't careful, he'd end up as something, or someone's, dinner before they could ever find him. Chapter 4. Gretchen Mirkwood. Enola bristled. "You'll tell me what you're about this instant." The gaggle of students giggled as Gretchen dragged both hands down her face. "No time for that, Enola. I've got a chicken to catch. You know how it is. Unless you've got a Venus chicken trap in that glass house of yours, I'm afraid I'll need to take a rain check on the small talk." The herbology teacher lifted a warning finger, her face mottled red. But Gretchen took Piper by the elbow and turned to the path at the back of the greenhouse before setting off at a protesting jog. The oak trees close to the wall shaded the gravel path that led to the dining hall, and Piper grabbed Gretchen's hand before skidding to a halt once they were clear of Enola and the students. "We're going the wrong way," she said. "It's quicker to go back through the classes toward the kitchens." "Ah," Gretchen said, holding her fist to her hips as she caught her breath. "Except we aren't going to the kitchens, are we? It'd take too long to get around the building again. No, there's an old gate through the wall this way. Came in handy once or twice back when I was at school." "There is." Gretchen barked a mirthless laugh and pointed at a bricked garden shed ahead, almost completely engulfed in the same ivy which grew over the walls. "Clearly I've still got a trick or two to teach you, kid. It's at the back of the shed. I'm guessing they still use it to bring in messier outdoor supplies into the academy." "Really? But wouldn't it be locked?" "Leave that to me, kiddo." Gretchen glanced down the path they'd used and nodded as if to herself. Then she hurried forward to the garden shed's heavy wooden door, its chipped green paint almost fading into the background. Piper lingered behind her, peering further down the path where overgrown rosemary bushes obscured the doors to the dining hall. A heavy bar across the door caused the hinges to groan almost as much as Gretchen as she heaved it off. It landed on the ground with a thud, and Gretchen pushed the door open a crack. "Needs oiling," she muttered, shoving her shoulder against the warped wood. "Are you sure this is the best way?" Gretchen shot her a withering look over her shoulder. "Ye of little faith." She gave the door one last shove, forcing it open just wide enough for them to slip inside. The musty scent of damp earth and dry rot filled her nose. She rummaged in her pocket, pulling a light charm from one of her many pockets with a muttered incantation. It flared to life, casting a soft glow across the cluttered interior. Dusty terracotta pots sat stacked on rickety shelves, their earthenware companions scattered across the floor, home to fat spiders and their intricate webs. Rusted tools hung haphazardly on the walls, casting long, grotesque shadows in the uneven light. "Watch your step," Gretchen said, carefully picking her way through the maze of gardening paraphernalia. At the back, half hidden behind a busted wheelbarrow and a moth-eaten sack of what might have once been fertilizer, stood a solid iron door. Gretchen made for it and held a hand against its cold and damp surface. "Helgard awaits," Gretchen said with a grin. The sounds of the city, the shouts of vendors, and the steady clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones took on a tinny quality as they reverberated off the door. Reaching up on tiptoes, Gretchen felt her way across the wall to what looked like a crumbled brick and pulled a key from a crack in the mortar. It was both grimy and sticky, causing Gretchen to grimace. "They leave the key right there," Piper said incredulously. "Well, it isn't just any old key," Gretchen said with a wry smile. "Back in my day, the groundskeeper had a little trick to keep absconders such as myself from using it. Now come here and hold this light charm, will you?" Piper took the proffered charm and held it toward the door. Gretchen examined the key closely, running her thumb over the tarnished metal, then used it to trace a series of symbols on the door's surface. A faint glow emanated from the metal, and Gretchen nodded in satisfaction. "There we go. This key is attuned to the wards on the door. Without the proper enchantment, it'll just be a useless hunk of iron." Gretchen inserted the key into the lock and gave it a twist. The door clicked open, revealing an alleyway leading into the market square. "Handy little trick, isn't it?" Gretchen said, glancing at Piper with a wink. "Very useful when you're sneaking out for a bit of mischief now and then." "Oh, Gretchen." Piper groaned as she extinguished the light charm and hurried past her to scan the area. "Come on, he isn't here." Gretchen placed the key back and closed the door behind them, her sense of victory over their escape from the academy quickly replaced by worry. "We'll find him. At least one person out there will remember seeing a purple chicken on their travels." Gretchen followed Piper into the bright sunlight of the market square, her eyes struggling to adjust after the dimness of the alley. The bustling scene before her made her head spin. Stalls overflowed with colorful fabrics, handcrafted trinkets, and fresh produce. Vendors hawked their wares with booming voices. The smells of roasted meat, exotic spices, and scented oils contrasted sharply with the earthy scents of the garden shed. "Mulligan," she called, her voice drowned out in the noisy square. She scanned the throngs of people, less certain than she was a moment ago about her familiar standing out in a place like this. But she had to find him. Who knew what kind of trouble a purple chicken could find in the city? "Quick," Piper hissed, tugging at Gretchen's sleeve. "Ask someone if they've seen him." "Right." Gretchen approached a woman with a face like a shriveled apple, tending to a stall bursting with brightly colored blooms. "Excuse me, ma'am. Have you seen a rather unusual chicken around here? Purple feathers, a bit of a swagger." The woman squinted at her, her gaze lingering on Gretchen's pointed hat. "Can't say I have. But if you see him pecking at my lilies, give him a good whack for me, would you?" Gretchen mumbled her thanks and hurried on, Piper trailing behind her. They weaved through the crowd, asking everyone they passed while dodging baskets of fish, squawking geese, and the occasional stray dog. "Excuse me," Gretchen said, stopping a burly man hauling a cartload of cabbages. "Have you seen a purple chicken?" The man snorted. "You're joking, right?" Grunting, Gretchen turned her sights across the way. A woman, swathed in layers of shawls, despite the heat, sat beside a rickety table piled high with herbs and dried roots. A toothless grin split her face as they approached. "I don't suppose you've seen a purple rooster run past, have you?" "Why, yes. He went that way. Fast as a whippet with its tail on fire." She jerked her chin toward an intersecting street, leading to seedier parts of the city. Gretchen tipped her hat to the woman despite the sinking feeling in her stomach and reached for Piper's hand. Together they pushed through the throng of people, and Piper halted at the street's mouth to pick up a purple feather from the cobbles. "He definitely came this way." Piper held up the feather, her brow furrowed. She pointed further down the street where another feather lay among discarded fish bones and rotting cabbage leaves. Gretchen's shoulders slumped with relief. At least we're on the right track. She snatched the feather from Piper and tucked it into her pocket. "Come on, no time to waste." Despite the bustling market they'd just left behind, this street was eerily quiet, the stench of mildew and rot feeling close as the path narrowed. The closely packed buildings, punctuated by decayed timber shutters and crumbled moldings, seemed to lean inward, as if conspiring to block the sunlight. Piper bent to retrieve every purple feather they passed, but even as her collection grew, more feathers lay scattered ahead, brighter in the gloom than they seemed in the market square. "Why would he go that way?" Piper asked, her face pinched with worry. Gretchen tried to sound confident, but the same question swam in her mind. He always was a mischief maker, wasn't he? Who knows, he could have developed a taste for ale and decided to grace a tavern with his presence. "Do you think someone might have?" Piper trailed off, her eyes darting nervously around the shadowy street. Gretchen understood her apprehension. The feathers, while initially reassuring, now seemed a little ominous. While her familiar had adapted to his new form quicker than he ought to, in Gretchen's estimation, he was used to being a predator and not the prey. "Let's not borrow trouble," she said, forcing herself to sound upbeat. "He's a resourceful little, well, you know, probably just following his nose, or looking for a good place to roost." "If you say so," Piper said doubtfully. "Well, we won't catch up to him just standing here. Let's get a move on." Gretchen quickened her pace, each discarded feather fueling her unease. The street twisted and turned like a serpent's tail. They passed a dilapidated storefront, its windows boarded up, a trail of purple feathers leading right through the gap where the door had once hung. A mangy tomcat, perched atop a toppled crate, eyed them with a disdain that rivaled Mulligan's at his finest. "Don't even think about it," she muttered as Piper reached a hand toward the bedraggled creature. The tomcat hissed, its ears flattening against its skull, and Piper snatched her hand to her chest. A group of rough-looking men swaggered past, their voices thick with drink and laughter, bumping shoulders with Gretchen without so much as an apology. She pulled Piper closer, her hand instinctively rummaging through the pocket underneath her cloak, where she stashed her more offensive bruise. She'd encountered more than her fair share of unsavory characters in Helgard's underbelly, and she wasn't about to take any chances. Certainly not with the kid in tow. But Piper was one step ahead of her as she ducked under the boards and through the doorway into the shop where the purple feathers led. Gretchen followed suit, casting a wary look over her shoulder at the ruffians to be sure they were well on their way. One of the men gave her a curious look as he stopped to relieve his bladder in the street, and Gretchen made a face as she hastened to shoo Piper further into the gloomy shop. Inside, there wasn't one piece of furniture that wasn't busted, and the only light source filtered through grimy, cracked windows. But Piper followed the feathers through the back and into an alley. After a few more turns, with the feathers spaced further apart, a side street opened into a small courtyard. The square was as gloomy as the rest, shrouded from the midday sun by a patchwork canvas awning strung between the surrounding buildings. A group of men, their faces obscured by the dim light, gathered around a rickety table piled high with wicker crates. Gretchen wasn't sure what she noticed first. Mulligan trapped in the crate at the top looking as ratty as a hen in full molt, or the ring of sand in the middle of the courtyard. Gretchen's blood ran cold. From the look of the men who were counting on fingers and pointing animatedly, she guessed what they were planning to use the ring for. It was one of many good reasons she didn't frequent the seedier parts of the city. "It's Mulligan," Piper hissed. She lurched forward, no doubt with her head filled with some ill-advised notion of demanding him back, but Gretchen caught the hood of her cloak and drew her behind a stack of wooden crates. "What do you think you're doing?" Gretchen whispered, "and they call me the foolish one." "But they must be merchants," Piper said. "They can't just steal him." "Merchants." Gretchen rubbed her eyes, not having the heart to tell the kid what some folks considered sport. "Well, I dare say if they had the gumption to just take him off the street, then they aren't the sort to just give him back. No, we've got to do this smart." Piper went to reply, but then her eyes became round as saucers. Gretchen followed her gaze to a woman striding toward them. She was tall and imposing, with an austere bun carved into her dark hair that did little to soften the sharp angles of her face. Her robes, a severe black with a high, boned collar, were immaculate despite the dust and grime that clung to everything else in this part of the city. She practically radiated disapproval. "Mistress Mendel," Piper whispered, clutching at Gretchen's arm. "Oh no, she can't see me here. If she catches me out of the academy, I'll be scrubbing cauldrons until I'm ancient." Gretchen didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Piper's hand and yanked her into a darkened doorway, just as Mistress Mendel drew level with their hiding place. Piper trembled in her grip as the witch swept past, her nose held high, sniffing with disdain. They watched as Mendel paused a few doors down, her gaze fixed on a building across the narrow street. Gretchen couldn't make out much in the gloom, just a ramshackle shop with a faded sign swinging precariously above the door. Mendel rapped sharply on the door with the head of her ebony cane, then waited, her posture stiff with impatience. Gretchen turned her attention to the men clustered around the cockfighting ring. They were busy arguing among themselves, shoving coins back and forth with increasing agitation. One of them spat on the ground, narrowly missing Mulligan's crate. Gretchen narrowed her eyes, debating whether she could conjure up a distraction significant enough to cause a panic, but one that wouldn't end with her familiar as collateral damage. "Will you hurry up?" she muttered under her breath as she switched to stare at Mendel. The teacher was still engaged in a hushed conversation with the man who'd answered her summons. A scrawny, nervous fellow with a greasy apron tied around his waist and a smudge of soot on his cheek. He wrung his hands as he spoke, his voice too low for Gretchen to make out the words. "Something about a delivery," Piper said, her eyes glued to the pair. Gretchen shushed her, straining to hear so she could estimate how long this would take. Just as she thought they'd never wrap up their little meeting, a few snatches of conversation reached her ears. "Rare ingredients," the man was saying, his voice trembling slightly. "Difficult to acquire, considerable risk involved." "Which is why I pay you well," Mistress Mendel snapped, her voice like a whip cracking. "See that it arrives on time, and be discreet." She pressed a small pouch into the man's hand, then turned and swept down the street, her robes billowing behind her like storm clouds. Gretchen ducked into the doorway, pulling Piper with her. "What do you think that was all about?" Piper said, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Sounds like all the alchemists in the city are hiking their prices." "That one sounded just as wheedly as my supplier," Gretchen murmured, peering cautiously around the doorway's edge. The teacher was now out of sight, but the men who stood between her and her familiar now moved the crates about, causing a twang of alarm in Gretchen's belly. "What's happening, Gretchen?" Piper's voice was laden with unease, and Gretchen knew she needed to come up with something before the kids saw something that she could never unsee. Gretchen's mind raced. A direct approach was out of the question, not with those bruisers and their grubby hands anywhere near her familiar and within reach of Piper. Gretchen's gaze fell on her ward, her brow furrowed in concern. And then it hit her. The wand, Piper, quickly. Piper blinked, rummaging through her satchel. "But what?" "Just hand it over. Quick," Gretchen said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Some people," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "have a twisted sense of fun and games. It's a lesson you'll have to learn someday, kid. Well, I say they deserve a taste of their own medicine." Understanding dawned on Piper's face, her eyes widening as she grasped Gretchen's plan. "You're going to." "Oh yes, indeed I am." "You stay right here." Gretchen plucked the wand from Piper's hand, then strode into the courtyard before the girl could object. The men, too caught up in their illicit dealings to notice her, continued to argue among themselves. Gretchen cleared her throat, a sound that cut through the air like a rusty saw blade. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "might I interest you fine fellows in a bit of a wager? I'm interested to know how many cockerels it takes to ruin a cockfighting outfit." They turned to stare at her, annoyance plain on their features. A wicked grin spread across her face. Then Gretchen raised the chicken wand high above her head, relishing the moment. "Rosa Verto," she shouted, her voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "Rosa Verto. Rosa Verto." One by one, the men flashed into stunned roosters, milling around the courtyard amid squawks and flapping wings. The effect, Gretchen had to admit, was rather dramatic. Grinning, she thought perhaps she might like to keep the chicken wand after their little investigation. She could think of 10 good uses for conjuring an entire flock of bewildered poultry. "Gretchen." Piper rushed toward her, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and alarm. "What have you done?" More than the constabulary would have been bothered with. Gretchen tucked the wand into her pocket, brushing past the girl as if transforming a group of hardened criminals into farmyard fowl was an everyday occurrence. "Come on, let's not dawdle. Those louts probably have friends, and something tells me they won't be too pleased about their associates' new plumage." "But what about them?" Piper gestured helplessly at the transformed men, who were now pecking at the ground and each other with increasing agitation. Gretchen waved a dismissive hand. "Poetic justice, I'd say. Now, come on." Together they hurried toward the stack of crates, Gretchen's eyes scanning the surrounding streets for any sign of approaching trouble. 5 crates in total, each one housing a pitiful feathered creature. Taking a moment to scoop up the coins from the table, Gretchen passed 2 crates into Piper's arms. They were lighter than she expected. She hefted the remaining 3 onto her own hip. "Let's go." Piper didn't need telling twice. They scrambled out of the courtyard and didn't stop running until they burst into the market square. Gretchen doubled over, gasping for breath, as Piper leaned heavily against a fruit stall, the crates stacked haphazardly between them. "Mulligan," Piper cried, peering anxiously into the crate at the top of her stack. The rooster cat glared at her, his purple feathers ruffled, looking scraggly, but no more worse for wear than he had in the courtyard. "They all seem okay, kid," Gretchen said, relieved. She scanned the bustling market, her gaze falling on a farmer hawking chickens and ducks from a pen at the edge of the square. "All right, time to find these other roosters some better prospects and then skedaddle back to the shop." Piper followed her gaze to the farmer and nodded, and Gretchen looked over her shoulder as they carried their makeshift flock into the throng of people, hoping that her little stunt didn't come back to bite them any time soon. Chapter 5. Gretchen sighed as she strode into Mirkwood Medicinals and set Mulligan's crate by the hearth. Piper followed close behind, carrying a wrapped bundle of pastries they'd picked up en route through the market square. Even Mulligan appeared grateful to return home as he clucked quietly, while Gretchen stoked the fire and tossed a few logs on top of the coals. And without the need to ask, Piper filled the kettle by the sink to prepare some tea. Gretchen listened with half an ear as Piper chattered excitedly, recounting every detail of their harrowing escape from the seedy underbelly of Helgard's poultry scene. The girl practically vibrated with energy as she bustled around the shop, filling a shallow pan with water for Mulligan and placing it within reach of the crate. "He must be thirsty," Piper said, her voice filled with concern as she peered into the crate. Imagine being forced to fight for wagers. It's barbaric. Apparently, the girl had come around to Gretchen's sense of justice after hearing what the men had really intended at the cockfighting ring. Gretchen grunted, her bones aching with the weariness of a long, eventful day, despite the sun remaining high overhead. She sank into her favorite armchair by the fire, the one with the patched-up upholstery and comforting creak. Then she picked up a cheese-filled pastry, nibbling at it slowly as her mind raced. "Do you think they'll just turn back once the enchantment wears off? What will you do if they come looking for you?" "Huh?" Gretchen frowned, focusing on Piper's nattering. "Oh, don't worry about that. I'd say they'll be scared witless when that happens. It'll be easier for them to pretend it never happened." Piper retrieved her pastry and sat cross-legged on the flagstone floor, tearing off small morsels to drop into the crate. Mulligan pecked them up greedily, and Gretchen smiled to herself. Even in rooster form, her familiar was still as eager as ever to beg for scraps, though it was probably less strange for a rooster to eat pastry flakes than it was for the cat she knew and loved filching a pie crust when he thought nobody was looking. "We have the hare now, though." Piper crumbled a lump of cheese in her fingers absently. "Do you think the spell will take long to brew? Surely somebody would have come to check on me in the dormitories by now." Gretchen chewed thoughtfully and stared into the new flames licking up the sides of fresh logs in the hearth. "Don't be a worrywart. I'm well within my right as your guardian to keep you home when you're unwell. As far as the spell goes, I guess that depends on whatever the spellbook dreams up." The spellbook. Despite feeling like she could put her feet up for the rest of the day, she knew she needed to consult the blasted thing. But it was a fickle beast, that book. Sometimes it offered its secrets willingly, other times, well, let's just say it had a temper. Gretchen needed an angle, a way to approach the book without it flinging insults, or, worse, setting her hair on fire. Piper chewed on her own pastry as Mulligan settled into the corner of the crate closest to the fire, hunkering down for a doze. The kettle whistled, so Gretchen pushed herself up to swing it clear of the fire, and used a mitt to pour the boiling water into the waiting teapot. As much as she would have loved to settle right down again for a siesta, she knew she had to get moving. Gretchen lumbered to the loose board under the counter and pulled out the heavy, leather-bound spellbook. After setting it down with a pat, Gretchen pulled up a stool with Piper hovering beside her, clutching the chicken wand and the packet of Muri's hair. "All right, you musty old doorstop," Gretchen muttered, tickling the leather binding. "Let's see what you've got." Piper laid the wand and the hair carefully beside the book. "Do you think it has something for this kind of problem?" "Of course it will," Gretchen said, though she shot a wary glance at the tome. "It better not be anything too outlandish. I don't have the energy for theatrics today." "Perhaps we should have snuck into the library," Piper said, peering at the book with a certain air of distrust. "It's not like we're asking for the moon here," Gretchen grumbled. She placed her hands on the book's cover. "Just a simple identification spell. Something to tell us who messed with Piper's wand." The spellbook remained stubbornly shut. Gretchen frowned and pressed her fingers against the cover more firmly. "Did you hear me?" A spell which will correctly identify the witch who enchanted this chicken wand, and make it snappy. The book shuddered, its pages rustling rapidly, before slamming open and throwing a crude drawing of a chicken running across the page into the air. The drawing fluttered onto the counter, landing face down in a puddle of spilled ink from earlier that morning. Gretchen scowled and swatted the drawing away with the back of her hand. This is serious. No time for your games. The book snapped shut, then opened again slowly to a page filled with a dense, spidery script. Gretchen leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. A serum of identification, she said, her frown deepening. Of course. And naturally, it requires a 3-hour distillation process and a sprig of moon petal that only blooms under a harvest moon. She let out a long, put-upon groan. Piper peered at the spellbook over Gretchen's shoulder, her brow creased with worry. Do you think the moon petals will be a problem? The spell seems very specific. Gretchen waved a dismissive hand. Ah, it's fine. I've got plenty of moon petals stashed away. Though their blooming habits are another story. A wry smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. But Saphira was always a fussy witch. I'm sure we can make do with what I've got. Piper didn't look entirely convinced, but she held her tongue, folding her arms across her chest. Gretchen grabbed a clay pot filled with dried herbs and began sorting through them, tossing aside sprigs of lavender and chamomile with a practiced hand. Don't you worry your pretty little head. It's a complicated process, but we've got time. Piper shifted from foot to foot, her brow still furrowed with worry. But what if it doesn't work? Then we'll figure something else out, Gretchen said with a shrug, pulling a face as she located the moon petals at the very bottom of the pot, crushed to near dust. There's always another way. Besides, I'll wager this serum is strong. Saphira Mirkwood wasn't in the habit of writing down inferior spells. You think so? Sure, Gretchen said with a wink, tapping the page of the spellbook. It's all about the distillation process. You see, the vapors have to pass by the enchanted object, in this case, your wand, so that the serum is infused with the essence of the spell, and more importantly, the witch who cast it. It begs the question of how one would ascertain the sorceress behind enchanting anything bigger than that wand, but I suppose the glass blowers in this city need to keep in business somehow. She pulled several oddly shaped glass flasks from the shelf, along with a burner and a tangle of tubes and stoppers. Once the serum is finished, we add a hair from our suspect. If it turns pink, well, then we know we've got our culprit. Pink? Piper tilted her head. Why pink? Because pink is the color of truth, Gretchen declared, brandishing a mortar and pestle with a flourish. Well, not really. But that's what the spellbook says, so that's what we're going with. Piper giggled, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. Gretchen smiled. That's it, she mused to herself. Let the worry melt away. A good dose of laughter was just what they needed. She made an absurd face as she fastened a glass tube to a rounded flask which elicited another giggle, but a thump on the door almost caused Gretchen to drop the flask in shock. Darn customers. Gretchen set the flask down gingerly and dusted her hands on her dress. Always here demanding this or that. Why me, Piper? Why do they have to come here? Because you sell potions, Piper said slowly with a raised eyebrow. Ugh. The potion business would be a lot easier without them, let me tell you. The customer at the door was one of the wretched folks who Gretchen had shooed off as they'd locked up the shop, earlier complaining of an ear ache causing an explosion of stars in her vision. After taking a few calming breaths when she refused to be turned away yet again, Gretchen rushed to a shelf to pluck down a tincture with an orange tinge and pressed it into her palm before slamming the door. See? Gretchen threw her hands in the air. It's always something. How did these people even manage before I set up shop? Piper smirked, then cleared her throat before turning her attention to the counter. Gretchen bolted the door shut and trudged over. She propped the spellbook up and used a jar to hold it open, then scanned the list of ingredients for Saphira's serum recipe. 3 sprigs of moon petal, 2 drams of powdered pixie, Gretchen read aloud, trailing off as her eyes scanned the rest of the list. Piper, grab me the brass scales, would you? And fetch the jar of pickled kneecap while you're at it. Piper's eyebrows shot up. Pickled kneecap. Don't ask. Gretchen pulled a face. Just be glad it's not a fresh one. But this apparatus is going to be a little crazier than I'm used to. Looks like we'll need more bits and bobs. With Piper's help, They gathered more components for the distillation process. Gretchen was surprised she had so many strangely shaped glass flasks, and a bewildering tangle of tubes and stoppers. She had to admit, even for someone as accustomed to the unpredictable nature of alchemy as she was, this contraption looked more like something out of a wizard's laboratory than her own humble workshop. She was quickly running out of room on the counter. Let's see. Gretchen traced a finger along the faded ink of the spellbook. First, we need to create a base for the serum. She measured a precise amount of powdered pixie and carefully poured it into a flask. Piper peered at the spellbook over Gretchen's shoulder. This looks really complicated. Are you sure we can get the measurements right? You know what they say. Measure twice and pour once, Gretchen said grimly. If we mess this up, at best, the serum won't work. At worst, let's just say it's best not to tempt fate. Piper's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't press the issue further, instead watching Gretchen's every move with rapt attention. They worked in companionable silence for a while, carefully measuring and blending the ingredients according to Saphira's instructions. Gretchen felt a familiar thrill course through her as the potion bubbled when she combined wet ingredients with dry. Despite the potential dangers, she'd always found a certain satisfaction in the meticulous precision of alchemy, even if she was a little loose with the precision and meticulous parts at times. Right, that's the easy part done, Gretchen said, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. Now for the distillation. Except this spell calls for 2 distilling flasks that need to be heated at the same time. How does that work? Piper asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Well, distillation is the process of separating the different components of a liquid by boiling and condensation. Gretchen gestured toward the elaborate glass contraption. Basically, we're going to heat this mixture until it turns into vapor, then cool the vapor so it condenses into a liquid. The purified liquid will be our serum. I know that, Piper said dryly. But I've never heard of distilling 2 liquids at the same time. It's tricky, Gretchen admitted. But it's the 2 vapors combining in the tubes that'll be the real potion, which is why getting the temperature right for both is going to take some doing. If we're not careful, the whole thing could explode, which is why I think we should take this contraption downstairs. It's the only place with enough room and the right kind of setup. Plus, the thick walls will help contain any mishaps. Piper winced at the mention of mishaps, but hurried to help Gretchen transport the delicate equipment. Gretchen paused, placing a steadying hand on Piper's shoulder. Don't worry, I've got this all under control, she said, her voice brooking no argument. Just stay close and keep an eye on things. I'll need 2 sets of eyes to make sure we don't blow ourselves sky high. With a nod, Piper gripped the tangle of glass tubes and flasks, following Gretchen as she led the way to the basement stairs. The cool, damp air hit them as they descended with an activated light charm, the soft glow casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. Gretchen connected the equipment with deft hands, motioning for Piper to set the components down carefully. All right, let's get this show on the road, Gretchen murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration as she placed the burner on a sturdy workbench. And put those flasks down. The warmth from your palms might be enough to have them heat unevenly. Piper nodded seriously and set the flasks on a stand, then took up an unobtrusive spot by the stairs. When Gretchen was done, she lit the burners, adjusting both flames until they emitted a steady blue heat of equal size. All right, let's begin, she said, pouring the potion base into the designated flask. And for goodness sake, Piper, if you see this thing start to shake, run. Gretchen watched, her stomach in knots, as the first of the potion base began to bubble. It wasn't long until a thin wisp of scarlet vapor rose from the flask on the left. Her fingers hovered beside the flame, ready to adjust the heat at a moment's notice. But the vapor remained steady, swirling upward in a hypnotic dance. Is it supposed to do that? Piper's voice was hushed with awe as a plume of emerald green vapor rose from the second flask, mirroring the scarlet in a separate tube. So far, so good. Gretchen held her breath as the 2 vapors met at the top of the apparatus where the chicken wand lay encased in a glass tube. Instead of repelling each other, the vapors intertwined, forming a swirling vortex of crimson and emerald. A low hum vibrated through the basement, and Gretchen leaned closer, captivated by the display. Piper watched, transfixed, as the tangled vapors mingled before them. After a moment she glanced at Gretchen, her brow furrowed. What color is the final serum supposed to be? Gretchen shrugged, her eyes fixed on the still. Saphira's recipe didn't specify, but I've got a feeling it won't be anything as dull as brown. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, droplets formed on the condenser's cooled surface. One by one, the droplets fell, like tiny iridescent jewels, into the waiting flask below. The serum, crystal clear, shimmered under the basement's dim light. That's the serum? Piper's nose wrinkled. It looks just like water. That's magic for you. Gretchen adjusted one stopper slightly, her voice tight with anticipation. Looks can be deceiving, especially. A loud thump from the shop above made Gretchen jump, jostling the glass tubing she'd been fiddling with. Piper startled and looked upward as though she'd just been caught red-handed in some nefarious adolescent scheme. Blazes, can a witch get a moment's peace? Gretchen said, shooting Piper a frustrated look. Customers. Honestly, they've got a sixth sense for knowing when I'm in the middle of something. Do you want me to go up? Piper offered, her gaze lingering on the still. Nah, you stay here and keep an eye on things, Gretchen said, waving a dismissive hand. I'll give them a piece of my mind and send them on their way. Gretchen hoisted herself up the creaky basement stairs, grumbling about the audacity of people interrupting a delicate alchemical process. When she reached the shop door, however, it wasn't an impatient customer she found, but a young man in the livery of the Witches' Academy, fidgeting with his cap. Mistress Mirkwood, he stammered, extending a sealed note toward her. A message from the Vice Chancellor herself. Gretchen's eyebrows shot up. Cordelia? Now what in the realms was going on? She snatched the note, already figuring it wasn't an invitation for tea and biscuits. Tell her I'll see to it right away, she said dismissively to the young man, then closed the door, already scanning the contents of the letter. But by the time she reached the stairs to the basement, her heart had plummeted to her boots. Ah, crap. What is it? Piper asked, alarmed by Gretchen's expression as the witch descended into the basement. A letter. What does it say? Gretchen cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly as she read the message aloud. Gretchen, return to the academy at once with Piper. I know you've been gallivanting around the grounds with a chicken while the girl was supposed to be unwell in bed. We need to discuss this blatant disregard for academy rules. I will see you in my office directly. Your sister, Cordelia. Piper's face fell as she glanced between the elaborate still and the note in Gretchen's hand. But the serum, she said, her voice tight with panic. It'll be hours before it's done. Our plan is ruined. Gretchen waved a dismissive hand, forcing a confident smile onto her face. Nonsense. Everything will be fine. Once the potion's finished distilling, we'll know who's behind your little wand mishap, and we can set things straight. Besides, it's not like we're disobeying a summons from the Vice Chancellor. It'll just take a little time to get there, is all. But it's only got a few drops. Piper gestured frantically at the beaker, her voice bordering on hysterical. Look at it. Gretchen chuckled, patting Piper's shoulder reassuringly. Relax, kid. It's just Cordelia. She can be a real toad sometimes. But it's all bark and no bite, really. Besides, Gretchen added with a wink, it's not like it's the first time I've kept her waiting. But Gretchen, what if she expels me? Piper squeaked, her features pinched with terror. She could. Oh, this is all my fault. If I hadn't. Hey, none of that now, Gretchen said, her voice firm. We're in this together, remember? And as for Cordelia, well, she's a stickler for the rules. But once you show her what Murray's been up to, this will all seem like small potatoes. She puffed out her chest, squaring her shoulders with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Really, she was far too old to be summoned to the Vice Chancellor's office for a lecture. But no buts about it, Gretchen said, cutting her off. We go, we face the music, and we deal with the consequences. But not yet, and if that means I take a bit of the heat for being tardy, then so be it. Now, come on. I could use a cup of tea down here if we're going to be watching this thing for the next few hours. And those jam tarts we picked up are sounding pretty good right now, too. Chapter 6. Gretchen and Piper took turns watching the still, the slow drips of finished serum taking an age to gather into the flask. After watching the kid alternate between fidgeting with textbooks in her bag and staring at the note from Cordelia, Gretchen put her to work tidying up. There were a few close calls with other customers demanding entry, but Gretchen refused to take any chances and kept the door bolted and the curtains drawn. It was a whole day of trade down the drain, but some things were more important than business. Is it ready yet? Piper's voice echoed down the narrow staircase. For the 100th time, no, it's not ready. Gretchen said, peering at the serum slowly dripping into the flask. "Alchemy takes time, girl. Patience." Setting aside her copy of the Witch's Digest, Gretchen stood with a grunt. She was confident the still wouldn't suddenly erupt in a shower of sparks and steam if she left it for a few minutes, and it sounded like the kid could use a distraction. Wiping her hands on her apron, Gretchen climbed the stairs, her knees groaning in protest. Mulligan's indignant clucking greeted her from his makeshift coop by the hearth. "And what's all the fuss about?" She said, peering at the purple rooster. He'd woken from his earlier doze and was currently attempting to dismantle the crate with his beak. "You're lucky I don't turn you into dinner, you feathered menace." The enchantment was stronger than she thought. That much was certain. Gretchen frowned. She'd hoped that after a few hours there might be a few telltale signs that the magic was wearing off. Some tufts of hair, the hint of a feline tail, or even some fabled hen's teeth poking through. But aside from being purple, Mulligan looked like any other barnyard cockerel. How long would it take to wear off? Would it wear off at all? Or would she need to consult an expert in transfigurations? "I think he wants some dinner." Piper crouched by the crate. "Should I fetch him some grain, or will that make him ill when he turns back? I've seen him eat some pretty questionable stuff in his time, but maybe not corn or grain. There's some old bread in the cupboard," Gretchen pointed. "But I'm not sure if he's going to turn back of his own volition anytime soon. That chicken wand sure is strong. If things don't pan out, we could always hightail it to Edgewater and start up a primary production outfit." She'd meant the last as a joke, but the color from Piper's face drained as she stared at Mulligan. Gretchen was tempted to throw in a quip about how much a farmer would be willing to pay for a chicken wand, but thought better of it. The kid was clearly torturing herself, and waiting around wasn't helping. "Hey, chin up," Gretchen nudged Piper's shoulder. "It'll be all right. We'll figure it out. That bird has more lives than a whole litter of alley cats up his sleeve." The girl just chewed on her lip, her brow still furrowed. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who's going to be scrubbing cauldrons all month for truancy." "A week, tops." Gretchen winked, trying to inject some levity into the situation. "Besides, think of it this way, wouldn't you rather be scrubbing cauldrons than have that stuck-up gold-worthy girl get away with this? I'll bet she gets worse than cauldron scrubbing." The thought seemed to cheer Piper a little. A slow smile spread across her face. "I guess. I'd like to see her cleaning the familiar kennels for Mistress Hawthorne for an entire term." "Exactly." Gretchen clapped her hands together, then retrieved a deck of lacquered cards from the mantelpiece. "So, what do you say we take a little break while we wait for this concoction to finish? How are you at exploding knave?" Piper's smile faltered, her gaze dropping to the note clutched in her hand. "But what about Cordelia?" "She can wait a little longer." Gretchen waved a dismissive hand. "Besides, if you're going to be punished for something, I say make sure it's worth it." Piper shrugged non-committally and fetched a stale loaf from the cupboard while Gretchen shuffled the cards. As Piper fed the rooster, Gretchen moved a small table and stool close to her armchair, but as she was about to get settled in, a loud knock came from the front of the shop, causing them both to startle. "Relax," Gretchen said after assuring herself that the still hadn't exploded downstairs. "It's just another custom." "Look." Piper pointed at the front door with a wavering hand. Gretchen moved to get a clear view of the door, her hackles well and truly bristling. The bolt on the inside slid open slowly, and the latch flipped of its own accord. As the door creaked open, Gretchen's stomach dropped. Cordelia stood on the threshold, rain dripping from the brim of her pointed hat. Her usually impassive features were twisted into icy fury as she stepped into the shop. The door slammed shut behind her, the echo reverberating through the cramped space. Gretchen stepped closer to Piper and placed a hand on her trembling shoulder. Without taking her eyes off her sister, Gretchen put herself between Cordelia and her ward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Cordelia, I can explain." "Explain." Cordelia's voice was low and dangerous. "Explain how my own sister and her ward have been trespassing in academy dormitories, tampering with student property, chasing a chicken of all creatures through the grounds, and who knows what other infractions." Gretchen opened her mouth, but Cordelia raised a hand, silencing her. "Save it. I don't want to hear your excuses," she fixed Piper with a withering glare. "As for you, young lady, I expected better. Skipping classes, breaking rules, do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" Piper shrank, her eyes downcast. Gretchen noted the girl's lower lip trembling and clenched her fists by her side. "Cordelia, please," Gretchen said. "Piper didn't mean any harm. We were only trying to." "Trying to what?" Cordelia snapped. "Undermine the academy. Put me in an impossible situation?" Her gaze swept the cluttered shop with a barely concealed sneer. "Or was this all just another one of your hair-brained schemes, Gretchen?" Gretchen bristled, but before she could respond, Cordelia held up a hand. "Enough. I have Lenora Goldsworthy in my office as we speak, demanding that this be dealt with at once. You can offer whatever petty excuses you have rattling around in that brain of yours at the academy." She turned on her heel, her cloak billowing behind her. "Cordelia," Gretchen bellowed, stomping her foot on the floor so hard that bottles lining the shelves tinkled. Her sister turned with her mouth open again, but Gretchen rushed to cut her off with a finger held up in warning. "You're not at the academy now, sister, so you can shut your trap and listen for once. Lenora can go jump in a lake for all I care. Piper came here this morning, because that stuck-up little Goldsworthy snot sabotaged her wand, and we're brewing something this very minute which will prove her guilt. So you can plant your keister by the fire until it's ready, and we can show you Exhibit A clucking away back there while we wait." Cordelia sputtered, momentarily speechless. But Gretchen didn't give her time to recover, grabbing her sister by the elbow and steering her toward the fire with a grunt. "See for yourself." Gretchen pointed at Mulligan, who had abandoned his escape attempt in favor of pecking at a stray breadcrumb on the floor. "Or are purple chickens commonplace in the academy?" Cordelia stared at Mulligan, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "That's," she began, then trailed off, shaking her head. "That's Mulligan. The one and only." Gretchen shoved her sister into the armchair with a gentle thump. "Now, sit there and try to absorb this next bit. That right there is what happens when your precious Mary Goldsworthy decides to play nasty with an up-and-coming witch who is more than her match in the enchanting department." Piper, emboldened by Gretchen's sass, stepped forward, clutching the note from Lenora. "Mistress Mirkwood," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "Mistress Mendel brought me into the advanced enchanting class. We were asked to enchant a wand to turn ribbons into flowers, except Murray enchanted a chicken wand instead and swapped mine with hers. I didn't mean to turn Mulligan into a rooster, but he got in the way when I tried to demonstrate the enchantment on a sack of beans." Cordelia's eyes widened, darting between Piper, the note, and the clucking purple chicken. "It's all here in the note," Piper continued, holding it out. "Her aunt, Mistress Goldsworthy, practically admitted it." Gretchen pulled up a stool, settling opposite Cordelia with arms crossed smugly. "So, go on, then. Tell us again how this is one of my hair-brained schemes." For a moment, Cordelia could only gape at the rooster, her face a mask of disbelief. Then, as the absurdity of the situation began to sink in, her expression shifted. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its usual authority, "and tell me everything." Piper and Gretchen exchanged glances, and the older witch gave Piper an encouraging nod. Her ward licked her lips and took a shaky breath but met her eye in silent agreement. When she opened her mouth, Gretchen leaned back, satisfied, and let Piper recount the day's misadventures. The girl was a natural storyteller when she wasn't wound up tighter than a gnomish clock, her words painting a vivid picture of their escapade. She told Cordelia about sneaking into the academy, discovering the incriminating note, and Mulligan's daring escape over the wall. She was waving her arms animatedly by the time she got to the part about the cockfighting ring incident, though Gretchen could tell she was still shaken by the ordeal. "And that's when you decided to use a transfiguration spell on those thugs?" Cordelia raised a skeptical eyebrow. "In my defense, it seemed like poetic justice at the time," Gretchen said with a shrug. "It was brilliant," Piper exclaimed. "One minute they were looking at us like they would put us both into those crates, the next they were running around squawking like—" all right, that's enough," Cordelia cut her off with pursed lips. "I get the picture." "Oh, and here's the letter." Piper fished the crumpled parchment from her pocket and handed it to Cordelia. "Lenora Goldsworthy talks about the special enchantment that Murray used to sabotage my wand." Cordelia scanned the note, her face hardening with each passing line. When she finished, she took an irritated breath. "This isn't exactly damning. It could be any number of enchantment spells." "Which is why we knew we had to brew something to prove her guilt," Gretchen said, unable to keep the smugness from her voice. "We'll see." Cordelia folded the note carefully and tucked it into her sleeve. "And this wand you speak of, where is it now?" "Right where it can't do any more damage." Gretchen stood and gestured toward the basement door with a flourish. "Come on, I'll show you." She led the way down the narrow staircase. The air remained thick with the scent of moonflower petals and strange, earthy aromas, the room lit by the pale glow of a light charm sitting on the bench by the still. Cordelia followed close behind, her face a mask of disapproval as she batted away a stray spider web hanging from the overhead beams. She obviously wasn't impressed with the cleanliness in the bowels of Mirkwood medicinals, but with Wren away collecting ingredients, the spiders had taken full advantage. Piper hovered beside Gretchen and Cordelia, wringing her hands as she stared at the still. "Here she is." Gretchen gestured to the chicken wand that lay suspended inside a glass chamber, bathed in the eerie green and red glow emanating from the steam. And a pretty impressive setup too, if you ask me. As you can see, the wand is currently out of reach, but I'd gladly give you a demonstration once the serum is finished. Cordelia peered at the wand, her brow furrowed. "This looks liable to blow up. Where did you say this spell came from?" "Aunt Saphira Mirkwood herself." Gretchen patted the side of the distilling apparatus proudly. "So if you don't trust me, then you should place your faith in our ancestor. You know as well as I do that she's one of the more studious witches in the family." "I see." Cordelia didn't sound convinced. "Once this is finished, we'll prove that it's this Muri kid who should earn your ire. And if you won't take our word for it, I can show you Saphira Mirkwood's recipe. We would have marched right over to your office earlier, except it clearly isn't ready yet." Cordelia cleared her throat and peered at the suspended wand to examine it closely. "Go and fetch the spellbook, will you, Piper?" Piper nodded and scurried up the stairs, leaving Cordelia and Gretchen alone. Cordelia took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the still. "This is no excuse, you know," she said. "Piper should have reported this to me instead of resorting to truancy and absconding to seek your help." Gretchen snorted and rubbed her nose with a chuckle. "You? Please. We both know who has the most experience with schoolyard pranks. And this Muri girl stitched Piper up. Can you honestly say you would have believed her?" Cordelia's lip twitched as she gave Gretchen a flat stare. "What are you suggesting, Gretchen?" "That a senior girl, a Goldworthy girl, at that, would have more clout with the likes of you than a bright-eyed youngster elevated to an advanced class before her time." "That's absurd, Gretchen." Cordelia turned to face her. "I'll have you know that I treat all students fairly and justly. The fact that you've encouraged Piper to go snooping around in another student's room, tampering with their belongings, and sneaking off the grounds just proves my point. Muri discovered that a rather expensive ribbon has been transformed into a flower, her belongings rifled through, and purple feathers strewn all over. Her Aunt Lenora has every right to be livid and demand answers." "Oh, there she goes." Gretchen threw up her hands and barked a mirthless laugh. "A Goldworthy witch has the right to be angry, but as Piper's guardian, I don't get any recourse when her wand is sabotaged by an older kid who's clearly jealous of Piper's talent. Yeah, that's fair and just all right." Gretchen watched her sister's face contort, her mouth opening and closing. She'd struck a nerve, and for once, Cordelia seemed at a loss for words. Gretchen glanced to the stairs where Piper stood hugging the spellbook, apparently having overheard the conversation. She scurried down the steps with a grim set to her features, and before Gretchen could press her advantage, Piper stepped forward, her chin held high despite the tremor in her voice. "Vice Chancellor, I'll accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate, but please, allow us time for the serum to finish brewing. We can prove Murray's guilt." Gretchen's heart swelled with pride at the girl's bravery. She'd come a long way in the course of a day, when the timid child had first arrived at her doorstep. Cordelia's brow furrowed, her internal struggle clear. She held out her hands for the spellbook, then carried it closer to the light charm on the bench. Her fingers traced the worn leather binding as she read Saphira's spidery scrawl on the page. "This serum," Cordelia said, not turning around. "How long until it's ready?" Gretchen exchanged a quick glance with Piper. Another hour, give or take. Saphira's recipes were never known for their brevity. Cordelia's shoulders sagged slightly. She turned, her brow creased with lines of resignation. "Very well. We'll wait for it to finish brewing before returning to the academy to face Lenora." Gretchen let go of a tense breath. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a start. She caught Piper's eye and gave her a subtle wink. The girl's answering smile was small but determined. "Thank you, Vice Chancellor," she squeaked. The hour inched past, stretched thin by the crackling fire and the steady drip of the still in the basement. Cordelia, ensconced in Gretchen's most comfortable armchair in the shop upstairs, had traded in her earlier fury for a detached coolness. Gretchen left her sipping tea with an air of forced patience, her gaze flitting between the pages of The Witch's Digest and the purple rooster by the hearth. Piper had fled to the mezzanine level upstairs, muttering something about homework, which Gretchen figured was an excuse to stay as far as possible from Cordelia while they waited. Gretchen, meanwhile, had resumed her vigil by the still, her gaze fixed on the liquid dripping slowly into the collection flask. The pungent aroma of moonflower petals, pickling brine, and something distinctly metallic filled her senses, keeping her alert even as her eyelids grew heavy. She glanced at her pocket watch from time to time, counting down the minutes until the serum would be ready. Finally, the last tendrils of steam whispered past the chicken wand to condense into drops splashing into the flask. Gretchen extinguished the flames under the empty flasks with a sigh of relief, then used a pair of mitts to free the chicken wand from the apparatus. Carefully, she decanted the luminous clear serum into 2 tiny vials, corking them tightly before tucking one into a hidden pocket of her dress. "It's ready," Gretchen announced, marching up the stairs. Piper practically flew down the stairs, nearly tripping in her haste. Her eyes, wide and eager, settled on the vial in Gretchen's hand. Even Cordelia, usually a picture of composure, straightened in her armchair, her gaze sharpening. Gretchen allowed herself a small, satisfied smirk. This, she thought, is what they call a captive audience. "All right, Piper, let's not keep the esteemed Vice Chancellor waiting any longer." Gretchen held out her hand. "The evidence, if you please." Piper, already one step ahead of her, placed the small, folded parchment packet into Gretchen's outstretched palm. With a dramatic flourish, Gretchen unfolded it and selected a single, fiery red hair. Holding her breath, she pushed it into the vial. The serum, crystal clear a moment before, erupted in a fizzing frenzy, tiny bubbles racing each other to the surface. The air filled with a faint, acrid odor like burnt sugar and something vaguely metallic. Gretchen held the vial aloft, letting the light from the blazing hearth catch the swirling liquid. But as the bubbles settled, the serum turned a sickly green, and Piper's eager face fell into horror. "Pink," Gretchen pled silently into the universe. The darn potion was supposed to turn pink. Chapter 7. "But," Piper shook her head, her eyes glistening with emotion, "why isn't it pink?" The look on the kid's face almost tore Gretchen's heart in two. Clenching her teeth, she gave the vial a shake, willing it to change color. But the serum only slouched over her fingers, remaining a stubborn shade of green. Cordelia cleared her throat and stood, wiping imagined dirt from her dress. "Well," Cordelia said, "now that we have a clear outcome, I should think it is time." "Hold on now," Gretchen cut in, setting the vial down with a decisive clink and wiping the muck off her fingers with a rag from the counter. "It didn't work is all we have to." "Didn't work?" Cordelia's eyebrows shot up. "It seems perfectly functional to me," green signifies. "That I made a mistake somewhere." Blast it all, Gretchen threw up her hands. "Let me check the spellbook. I'll bet I've double-measured something along the way." "That do it." "Gretchen," Cordelia snapped, "we've wasted enough time. We are returning to the academy. At once." Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose and took a deep breath. Piper swiped at her eyes, leaving a smear of soot on her cheek. The piteous look on her face was enough to make Gretchen want to smash things. How could she let her ward down like this? "There's no need for tears, child," Cordelia said, her tone softening slightly, "though you ought to have come to me in the first place. It's clear Murray did not sabotage your wand, and now you've put yourself in quite the predicament. Come, let's bring Mulligan along with us. Harriet will set him right again." Piper met Gretchen's eye for a moment, then wiped her nose with her sleeve and hugged her arms. And as much as it pained her to admit it, Gretchen knew her bag of tricks was empty. With sagging shoulders, she moved to collect Mulligan's crate and her cloak from a hook, her limbs leaden with disappointment. Cordelia was right. The purple chicken cat needed urgent magical attention, and her plan to expose Murray had failed. But that didn't make it any easier to confront the misery in Piper's eyes. The girl kept her gaze lowered as they followed Cordelia into the rain. A pang of guilt bloomed in Gretchen's gut at the sight. and she wished she could somehow make this right. That Piper had come to her with a problem at all was remarkable, and Gretchen struggled to reconcile the fact that she'd only made things worse. With Cordelia leading, Piper walked beside her in somber silence, her boots splashing through puddles. Gretchen stole a glance at the girl, wishing she could offer some comfort. But the weight of their failure hung heavy between them. But then Gretchen clutched at the hidden pocket in her dress, her mind sparking with an idea. The strength of the chicken wand alone suggested that a powerful witch with demonstrated expertise was responsible for its creation. That Mulligan hadn't turned back after hours clucking around the city was a testament to that alone. Perhaps they'd been barking up the wrong tree the entire time. Fumbling to draw the vial out, she nudged Piper's shoulder and bent to whisper in her ear. "It ain't over yet, kid," she said. "I've got another dose right here, and Cordelia is leading us right to the witch we should use it on." Piper blinked, her eyes darting between Gretchen and Cordelia's back. "Lenora." "Sure, why not?" Gretchen said, the urgency in her hushed tone growing as the idea took form. "She said it herself. Didn't she? Whatever means necessary. I wouldn't put it past her to give the niece a head start once she heard you'd joined the class. No, the last thing that woman would want is one of her kin shown up by a youngster like you." Piper sucked in a sharp breath, and Gretchen was glad to see the cogs turning in the kid's mind. She didn't reply right away, and Gretchen steered them through the mess of folks trying to get to where they needed to be as the rain gathered steadily in the cobbled gutters. The general populace seemed to give way to Cordelia, though, who strode with her nose in the air, and the commanding air of purpose she usually brought in her wake. "You really think it will work?" Piper asked after a time. "You betcha, kid. You just leave the talking to me." Gretchen hurried along behind Cordelia with one arm around Piper's shoulder and the other wrangling Mulligan's crate. It wasn't long before they arrived at the steps leading into the academy, the wide, arched doorway yawning before them. They huddled inside, shaking droplets from their cloaks, and wiped their boots on the worn mat. Even Mulligan appeared to appreciate the shelter as he puffed out his feathers to dry off. Piper, however, didn't move to follow them further into the marble-tiled foyer beyond. She stood frozen, her gaze fixed on something. "Come along," Cordelia said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "We can go past Harriet's office on the way." But Piper didn't budge. She tightened her grip on Gretchen's sleeve and pointed a finger, her eyes wide. "Look." Gretchen followed her gaze to a man standing at a counter. He wore a simple apron tied around his waist and clutched a brown paper parcel tied with string. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him in the crowd of folks going about their business. Gretchen squinted, trying to get a better look. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place him. "Don't you recognize him?" Piper whispered. "He's that alchemist we saw Mistress Mendel with earlier." Recognition dawned on Gretchen, and she urged Piper onward with a frown. "So it is. Geez, I wish my suppliers were that prompt on deliveries." But as they passed the counter where a younger witch was listening to the man with an air of impatience, the pair overheard the conversation. "Mistress Mendel's favorite tarts. She asked for them to be sent at once. Can't have them going stale in the box now, can we?" Piper and Gretchen shared a frown as they dawdled past, and Cordelia looked over her shoulder in irritation. "I think we've kept them waiting long enough, don't you? Hurry up, the both of you." Gretchen cleared her throat and pointed to a bench seat. "Oh, would you look at that? Your bootlaces are undone, Piper. Sit down and let me take care of that." Cordelia huffed, but didn't protest as Gretchen waved Piper to sit and set Mulligan's crate on the ground. The rooster clucked in interest as Gretchen crouched over Piper's boot, fumbling with the tied laces. "That's a little strange, don't you think? Ordering special supplies is one thing, but a discreet delivery service like that seems a little over the top." Piper nodded surreptitiously. "I thought it was odd that she was ordering ingredients from an alchemist at all. The supply cupboards at the academy are crammed with all sorts of things. They're brought in by the wagon load." Gretchen hadn't considered that, but Piper's skepticism made sense. And come to think of it, why had this Mendel woman bumped Piper up a couple of classes to be with the senior girls in the first place? Had she done so to take her down a peg or two after shaming her in front of a crowd of older girls? But why? It was more than mean to set the kid up. It would be fatal to her teaching career. But Gretchen's trust in the average card-holding member of the academy amounted to the faith she had in the week-old pies sold by seedy vendors in the marketplace, and that left her blinking at Piper's bootlaces, wondering who was the more likely witch to blame, Lenora or Mendel. "What will we do?" Piper hissed. Gretchen patted Piper's knee as she stood with a grunt. "I'll handle it, kid." Piper opened her mouth to press further, but Cordelia snapped at them to hurry, so Gretchen took Piper's elbow and began the slow ascent to Cordelia's office. Why her sister chose to reside near the darn rafters of the building was a puzzle Gretchen had spent a good amount of time cursing about over the years, but on this particular occasion it afforded her a chance to reason through the situation. Gretchen's boots thumped against the worn stone steps, each footfall echoing in the stairwell. Cordelia, a few paces ahead, navigated the seemingly endless ascent with an effortless grace that Gretchen, despite her years of clambering around Helgard's underbelly, couldn't muster. Her gaze drifted between the hem of her sister's robes and Mulligan's crate, her mind awhirl. Who was the more likely suspect? Lenora had skin in the game. Her niece's reputation at the top of the class was clearly important to her. But Mendel's clandestine activities in the marketplace showed she had something to hide. But was it even related to Piper at all? It could very well be some unapproved ingredients to use in a brew of her own choosing, which was none of Gretchen's business. Mulligan, sensing her distraction, pecked at her knuckles through the crate's wicker bars, causing Gretchen to curse under her breath. "Mind the bird, Gretchen," Cordelia said without turning. "He's a cat," Gretchen muttered under her breath, shifting the crate to her other hand. "At least he used to be." They rounded another landing, this one lined with dusty portraits of stern-faced witches from centuries past. Gretchen imagined their painted eyes following her, judging her every step just like they did when she was a pupil. "You, Amelia," Cordelia called to a young witch rushing past, her arms laden with scrolls. "Take this, Fowl, to Mistress Harriet. Tell her it's urgent." The girl, startled, fumbled with the scrolls as Cordelia thrust Mulligan's crate into her arms. "But Mistress Mirkwood," the girl said, "I have a—" "That's quite all right, Amelia. This won't take a moment." She fixed the girl with a stare that could curdle milk. "Now off you go." The girl, her face pale, scurried down the corridor, clutching the crate close. Gretchen hoped Mulligan wouldn't tear the scrolls she gripped into ribbons by the time she arrived at Harriet's office. "Now," Cordelia said, turning toward a heavy, iron-wrought door at the end of the hall, "I expect you to be on your best behavior. I'm talking to you, Gretchen." Gretchen made a face behind Cordelia's back, causing Piper to stifle a laugh behind her sleeve, despite their dire circumstances. The door creaked open, revealing a spacious office bathed in the warm glow of enchanted lamps. Cordelia swept inside, her robes billowing behind her, and Gretchen followed, pulling Piper along by the hand. Cordelia's office was a testament to her love of order and control. Every book on the shelves stood at attention, spines perfectly aligned. Scrolls lay flat in their designated trays, weighted by gleaming crystals. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, banishing the chill from the stone walls. Lenora Goldworthy, a woman who could make a throne look like an afterthought, sat ramrod straight in a high-backed chair near the fire. A girl in full adolescent bloom, Murray, by Gretchen's estimation, perched beside her, the picture of youthful arrogance. Gretchen hid a smirk. If those two weren't the embodiment of Witch Academy politics, then Gretchen would eat her pointed hat. And then Gretchen's gaze fell upon Mistress Mendel, who stood by the window, her back to the room. Something about the witch's rigid posture, the way she held her head, struck a chord in Gretchen's memory. She was sure she'd never met the witch before, but her mind turned on which magical family the woman belonged to. As if sensing her scrutiny, Mendel turned, and Gretchen found herself staring into a pair of cool, appraising eyes. The sense of familiarity intensified, prickling at the edges of her thoughts. It was like trying to grasp a wisp of smoke. Before Gretchen could delve further into the recesses of her memory, Cordelia cleared her throat, her expression tight. "Now that we're all here," she began, her voice laced with disapproval, "perhaps we can finally get to the bottom of these accusations." "Here, here," Lenora said, her voice sharp as shattered ice. But before either woman could continue, Gretchen stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Mendel. "You know, I think we could all use a nice cup of tea right now," she said, her voice bright and overly cheerful. "And maybe a plate of those delicious-looking tarts I saw being delivered earlier." A flicker of something, annoyance maybe, crossed Mendel's face. Tarts. It hardly seems appropriate. "Oh, but I think you'd agree that there's nothing worse than a stale tart, wouldn't you, Mistress Mendel?" Gretchen interrupted, her tone light despite the tension thrumming through her. Gretchen, Cordelia said, with a warning note in her voice. You can satisfy your sweet tooth in the kitchens later. Sit down so we. Let her answer the question. Gretchen held up a hand to silence her sister. Stale tarts, Mendel. They're a travesty, are they not? Mendel shifted awkwardly as every eye in the room fell on her. I can assure you I have no opinion on such matters. Ah. Gretchen tapped the side of her nose and winked. I see. You're the type who enjoys her tarts behind closed doors. What in the light is she talking about? Lenora leaned forward in her seat, though her words were directed at Cordelia. I heard your sister was odd, Cordelia, but she sounds quite deranged. Is she really fit to be a guardian to a young witch? Gretchen's eyes snapped to Lenora, and she pulled her arm around Piper's shoulder. One could say the same about you, Goldworthy. But before we get to that, I'm going to insist that Mendel shares her freshly delivered box of tarts with us. It's pertinent to our investigation. Isn't that so, Piper? What are you talking about, Gretchen? Cordelia seethed. Still standing, she'd bent over her desk to grip the lacquered top tightly, as though it was the only thing keeping her from throttling her insolent sister. Gretchen took a deep breath, and her face cracked into a wide grin. Well, of course, you're aware that we have ruled out Murray Goldworthy as the culprit behind the sabotage of Piper's wand. But to catch these folks up, let me break it down. Mendel here decides to bump Piper into the senior class and sets a wand enchantment assignment. Piper aces it and enchants a wand that not only turns ribbons into flowers, but specifically roses that match the color of the ribbon in question. We found that among Murray's effects, by the way, and I'm sure you've got the phoenix feather-colored rose to prove it. Miri opened her mouth indignantly, and Gretchen shook her head at the girl, tutting. Now the wand that Piper found in her room this morning turns things into chickens. That's right, the real live poultry variety, and I've got a purple rooster to show for it. But after collecting a few strands of hair from Murray's comb, we established she wasn't the witch responsible for enchanting it. Murray's mouth snapped shut, and she folded her arms with a scowl which almost rivaled that of Lenora's. Gretchen guided Piper toward a seat and leaned over the back of the chair. She's admitted it. Lenora stuck a finger toward Gretchen. The indecency. You should have her license for this, Cordelia. That, or I'll. Save your outrage for later, Lenora. But that reminds me of the letter you wrote to your niece, telling her that she should stay at the top of the class by whatever means necessary, and something about a special enchantment you showed her. Gretchen rolled her eyes and waved a dismissive hand. But Cordelia has that little nugget in her safekeeping, so we can round back to that later. Now, where was I? Oh yeah. Now I never thought to question why Mendel here was so interested in my young ward, but of course we saw her while in hot pursuit of my familiar come rooster Mulligan. Making a shady deal with an alchemist in a seedier part of town, she was. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course. I've made a questionable deal or two in my lifetime too, but... Get to the point, Gretchen, Cordelia snapped. Gretchen blinked and gave her sister a bland look. But it was Mendel shifting on her feet that caused the smug smirk to twist her lips, and Gretchen shared a look with Piper. The point. Sure. I think Piper here can attest to what we saw in the foyer just now. Piper let out a squeak, and Gretchen gave her shoulder an encouraging squeeze. While she didn't want to shame the kid, she was sure they were onto something as Mendel's eyes sharpened with a certain wariness. When all the eyeballs in the room had settled on Piper, the kid cleared her throat and shifted in her seat. Well. It's only that the alchemist we saw in the city was down there, but he didn't say he was an alchemist at all. He told Mistress Sasha that it was a delivery of tarts, and that they should be sent to Mistress Mendel right away. He wore an apron like he was a baker or something. I didn't see him wearing it earlier. My deliveries are none of your concern, Mendel said, and I don't see what this has to do with. Ah, but I think you do. Gretchen drew the spare vial of serum from her pocket and held it up. Miri wasn't responsible for the chicken wand, but someone was. Luckily, I've got a spare dose of my great-aunt Saphira's serum of identification. Now I'm thinking that the package should be brought in here pronto. If it's only tarts that the alchemist delivered, then I think we should use this little potion on Lenora here. But if it turns out you're bringing in contraband ingredients into the academy, Gretchen shrugged theatrically, relishing the twin looks of horror on Mendel and Lenora's features. The room crackled with tension. Gretchen imagined sparks flying off their glares, crackling like her own fizz-bangs. Cordelia, her frown deepening the lines around her mouth, focused on Mendel. Well, Sabine? Sabine, Gretchen mused. Sabine Mendel. Now where had she heard that name before? But the teacher crossed her arms, a defensive stance that distracted Gretchen from following that line of thought. This is absurd. I won't stand for. Cordelia slammed her hand on the desk, making Gretchen jump. And I won't stand for clandestine dealings underneath this roof. And you never sought permission to elevate Piper into your advanced class. So either you open the package here, in front of witnesses, or I'll have the entire council searching your rooms before nightfall. Mendel's face paled. You wouldn't dare. Try me, Cordelia said, her voice cold. Then she reached for a bell on her desk and rang it with an air of finality. Gretchen had to be careful to stifle a laugh. This was going better than expected. Mulligan would have loved to sink his claws into the tension hanging in the air. Shame he was off with Harriet. A young witch, the same one who had been saddled with Mulligan earlier, scurried into the room. Her eyes darted nervously between the assembled witches, her grip tight on a stack of books. Yes, Vice Chancellor? Go to Mistress Mendel's office and bring me the package that was just delivered. Amelia, her face now completely drained of color, nodded. Yes, Vice Chancellor, right away. She practically ran out of the room, clutching the books to her chest like a shield. Gretchen took the opportunity to pull up a chair next to Piper and sat with a wide grin, bumping her ward's shoulder eagerly. Piper's own smile was tight with anxiety, but Gretchen figured they were minutes away from figuring out exactly who had sabotaged her wand. Pulling out a pocket knife, Gretchen dug at the dirt encrusted under her nails with an air of nonchalance, enjoying the look of disgust on Lenora's face as she considered her from across the room. It was all part of the fun, and Gretchen figured she had earned a little gloating since she was within a literal hair's breadth of victory. Chapter 8. Amelia, bless her cotton socks, scurried into the office, clutching the wrapped parcel tighter than a miser's purse strings. Gretchen nudged Piper, a silent communication of shared suspicion passing between them. Cordelia gestured for Amelia to place the basket on her desk. The girl practically flung it down, eager to escape the room's charged atmosphere. As soon as she'd fled, Cordelia's gaze shifted to Mendel. The witch's face had taken on a sickly greenish tinge. Gretchen almost felt a twinge of pity, but then reminded herself that Mendel was the likely architect of Piper's misery. Cordelia cleared her throat and tugged the twine binding the parcel. The aroma that wafted out wasn't sweet pastry, but something earthy, pungent, and decidedly untart-like. Inside, wrapped in linen, were several small, sealed glass jars. Each contained a different substance: shimmering powders, viscous liquids, dried herbs. Gretchen's face cracked in a wicked grin. Well, Sabine? Cordelia's voice was laced with ice. Care to explain? Mendel stammered. These are for research. A sleeping brew. She dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief, her hand trembling. A sleeping brew requiring powdered bloodwort and essence of nightshade. Cordelia raised an eyebrow, her expression conveying disbelief. I wasn't aware such potent ingredients were required for simple insomnia. Gretchen couldn't resist. I'd say those 2 ingredients ought to put someone to sleep for a very long time, if you catch my drift. She winked at Piper, whose eyes bugged out. Mendel glared, her eyes narrowed to slits. This is outrageous. I am a respected member of this faculty. A respected member of this faculty who appears to be breaking academy regulations regarding the importation of restricted substances, Cordelia said, her voice sharp. Mendel's composure finally cracked. But Lenora. Lenora, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, now spoke, her voice smooth as silk. Cordelia, I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. Sabine is a brilliant alchemist. Perhaps these ingredients are for a project sanctioned by the headmistress. A simple oversight, I'm sure. Cordelia's gaze shifted to Lenora, her expression unreadable. I don't suppose you know something about this? Lenora lifted her chin. My comings and goings aren't your concern, Cordelia Mirkwood. Gretchen felt her face falling, the victory which had hung right before her crooked nose now less certain. She shared a wary look with Piper, who shrugged, and Gretchen bit her lip, trying to recall all the spells she could think of using the 2 ingredients. But it was for naught. Cordelia's jaw stiffened as she turned her gaze to her sister. Well, Gretchen, it seems that you get your wish. You have 1 more dose to discern the witch responsible for enchanting this paltry wand. Are you certain that Sabine should be tested? Gretchen swallowed as all eyes in the room fell on her, and she flinched when Piper gave her knee a squeeze. She turned a warm smile to her young ward and smacked her lips. "Well, it wasn't me who was pranked." She took Piper's hand in hers. "I say we let Piper decide." The girl's eyes widened as the attention in the room swung to her, and she shifted in her seat as her eyes darted between the likely culprits. Murray folded her arms, her face an insolent scowl. Well, before we arrived, I was certain it must have been the special spell mentioned in Lenora's letter which was responsible." Piper avoided meeting the stern witch's gaze, who sneered at the words. "But now I'm not sure. It seems Mistress Mendel isn't above breaking rules, but I don't understand why she would want to do something like that, especially after she brought me into the class to begin with." Gretchen was proud to see her ward hold Mendel's eye as she said the latter, and furious at the same time to see the older witch shift on her feet. Expelling her from the academy wouldn't be enough to see justice done. Gretchen vowed that she would make the witch's life a misery henceforth if she was the culprit. "You only have one dose," Cordelia said, though her soft voice belied her stern stare. "I suggest you choose wisely." Piper's lip trembled, and she shrunk in the seat like she wished it would swallow her whole, but after a moment she appeared to pluck up some resolve as she nodded slowly to herself. "I think it should be used to test Mistress Mendel." The tension in the room dropped a few pegs, just enough to allow Gretchen to breathe easier, even if her shoulders were as rigid as a fence post. Mendel dragged a hand over her face, then glared right at Gretchen. Surprised, Gretchen recoiled. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" Mendel said. Gretchen blinked and shook her head. "Sure I do. You're just another hack witch who thought she'd try her hands at politics at the academy." Mendel's face mottled into vicious shades of red and purple. Reaching to pluck a single hair from her bun, she held out pinched fingers with the gray hair dangling in the air. Her eyes continued to bore into Gretchen, and Cordelia frowned as she plucked the hair away from her. Piper, apparently eager to get out of range of the woman's stare, scuttled to Cordelia's desk with the spare dose of serum. "All these years, and I'm just as invisible to you now as I was back then," she said. "Even after you ruined the biggest opportunity of my life." Gretchen sat straighter to look behind her seat, as though someone should be standing behind her. Someone for whom the words might make an inch of sense. But a single bureau stood against the wall-papered walls of Cordelia's office, adorned with knickknacks reeking of dried flowers. Gretchen swung around again, her face twisted in confusion. "Me?" She pointed to her chest. "Yes, you, Gretchen Mirkwood," Mendel said. "Like I'd ever forget that name in a million years. Not after what you did to me when we were both pupils within these very walls." Gretchen looked to her sister, hoping beyond hope that Cordelia could shine a little sense on the situation. Light knew she'd kept a long list of all of Gretchen's misdeeds growing up. But Cordelia's eyes didn't sharpen with understanding. In fact, she looked about as puzzled as Gretchen felt. "Sabine Mendel," Gretchen tasted the words on her tongue, like they could conjure up a memory which would provide some blessed context for this situation. "Nope, I've got nothing." Mendel hissed and took 3 long strides across the room to loom over Gretchen's chair. With her fists balled at her sides, Gretchen wasn't sure if she would be in for a black eye come morning, and it took some doing to sit still under her menacing glare. Mendel's face twisted with a bitterness that chilled Gretchen to the bone. "You honestly don't remember, do you? How could you? You were probably too busy planning your next escapade to notice the devastation you left in your wake." Piper faltered as she uncorked the serum as Mendel's gaze blazed with fury. "It was the advanced alchemy exam. My elixir of everlasting bloom, a masterpiece of meticulous planning and precise execution, was ready for Madame Eldrun's discerning eye. My future, my apprenticeship, hung in the balance." Mendel's voice cracked, the memory apparently raw even after all these years. "I added the final ingredient, or so I thought. The featherstock dust, carefully measured and labeled, from the top shelf of the store's cupboard. But it wasn't featherstock dust, was it? It was powdered sneezewort, Gretchen, in an advanced alchemy potion." She paced, agitation radiating from her like heat from a furnace. The entire store's cupboard went up in a cloud of, well, let's just say Madame Undown made a hasty retreat, clutching her nose. "My elixir, my future ruined. I was mortified, humiliated. And you?" Mendel stopped pacing, her fingers clutching at the air like she could rip a hole through it. "Later, of course, the truth came out. You'd been caught red-handed, or should I say, orange-handed, covered in fire powder residue. You'd ransacked the store's cupboard as only Gretchen Mirkwood could, switching labels, pilfering ingredients, making off with enough fire powder to take out half the astrology classroom. And then it dawned on me. All my careful work, my flawless potion, undone by your childish prank. My hopes of an apprenticeship gone. Poof. Just like that. Mendel gestured sharply. Next year your sister comes in with her fancy elixir of everlasting bloom and promptly charmed Eldrun right under my nose. That apprenticeship was mine, and where was I? Nowhere. Not a single prospect awaited me after graduation. Your fault. All my hard work for nothing. How does it feel now, Gretchen? You may never have given a whit about academic success, but it's clear you now have someone you care for who does. Mendel's accusation hung in the air, thick with resentment. Gretchen stared at her, the fragmented memories swirling. A mischievous grin, a chaotic dash through the store's cupboard. The thrill of a successful prank, a perfect explosion executed. She hadn't even known about Mendel's elixir, or about Eldrun's visit, let alone the shattered dreams left in her wake. Well. It's pink. Piper's voice sliced through the room, causing Gretchen to startle. The serum. It turned pink. Mendel didn't bother looking over her shoulder at the proof of her misdeeds, and Gretchen had to tear her gaze away and crane her neck to get a good look. But the victory in Piper's eyes only made Gretchen flinch. It was her fault the kid had been put through all this nonsense, all because of some decades-old prank she'd pulled. What do you have to say, Mirkwood? Mendel hissed. Was it worth it to see me cast down a second time while you wriggle your way clear of the consequences? Gretchen blinked. Of course not. I might not give a fat froggy's bottom about all this, she waved her hand around the room, learned nonsense. But Piper does, and I care about her. Gretchen stood, coming nose to nose with Mendel, and that you'd punish a kid to get to me is low. Lower than anything that I pulled back in the day. Mendel opened her mouth, and Gretchen stepped aside with a grimace. She met her sister's eye, who only arched a tart eyebrow for once, waiting for her to continue. But if I messed up something that big for you, well, I'm sorry. If you had have come and told me about it, I would have said the same years ago. You can say what you want about me, but I always wore the consequences of my actions. Well, the ones that they found out about, anyhow. Did you even tell this Elduck woman about the mix-up? Eldrun, Mendel corrected with a scowl. And of course not. She would have reprimanded me regardless for not checking before adding the sneezewort. And so she should have, Cordelia said. You made a mistake in your haste to Sabine. One that cost you an opportunity you've lived to regret. And the bitterness you've held on to comes at a cost. I will not have pupils under this roof serve your need for vengeance. Not on my watch. You had an opportunity here, and now you've squandered it. Gretchen dragged a hand over her face, torn between justice for Piper and the misery of Mendel. The witch kept her nose held high as she turned to face Cordelia, but her lips trembled. Piper corked the serum and placed it on Cordelia's desk before stepping out of the way. Let's not be so hasty now, Cordelia. Lenora stood with the assistance of a brass-tipped cane. This should be for the council to think on, don't you agree? Cordelia's head whipped to the old woman, her features icy. The faculty is mine to command, Lenora. Tell me, what interest is it of yours? Unless you have some particular insight into those ingredients. Gretchen hurried to Piper and put her arm around the girl's shoulders, relieved that the attention in the room had left them both forgotten in that moment. And as Lenora came to stand side by side with Mendel, Gretchen held Piper even closer. Sabine is a fine alchemist. Exceptional, really. That bloodwort and nightshade are contraband in this day and age. Absurd. In my day, a witch got a proper education within these walls, and I insist on Miri receiving the very best tutelage, which is why I engage Sabine for private lessons. Outside of classroom hours, of course. All quite above board, really. Cordelia's eyes whipped between Mendel, Lenora, and Murray, who had slid down in her seat, her earlier insolence fading from her features. Above board? I am well within my right to order restricted alchemical ingredients into this academy. Cordelia's voice took on a shrill tone. I think not. Yes, this will be discussed at the council, Lenora. Your actions concerning a former faculty member will be scrutinized, but we shall speak of that later. Murray? Piper? I believe you both have classes to attend. Murray slunk out of the room, her shoulders slumped and her head down. Piper, on the other hand, practically bounced out, a triumphant grin plastered across her face. As she passed Gretchen, Piper shot her a surreptitious thumbs up, which Gretchen returned with a wink. While she didn't feel quite as upbeat as her ward, Gretchen was proud that the kid held her own against some of the most powerful witches in the academy. Gretchen made to follow, eager to escape the suffocating tension that still crackled in the air, but Cordelia's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Gretchen, stay. I need a word." Gretchen's shoulders slumped. Of course she did. She turned to face her sister, plastering on what she hoped was a convincingly innocent smile. Lenora, still standing ramrod straight beside Mendel, shot Gretchen a venomous glare. Gretchen couldn't resist a toothy grin in return. Let the old bat stew on that. Cordelia addressed Lenora and Mendel, her voice as cold as a winter wind. "You may go, Lenora. The chicken wand is none of your concern. Sabine, I expect that your belongings will be removed from the academy by nightfall, and your person along with them. You may lodge an appeal of your dismissal to the council directly, if that is your wish, but any outcome will be public. Very public." Lenora's mouth tightened, but she offered no further protest. With a curt nod, she turned and swept out of the room, Mendel trailing behind her like a shadow. The click of Lenora's cane against the polished floor echoed in the sudden silence. As the door closed behind them, Cordelia let out a long sigh, the rigid posture she'd maintained throughout the confrontation finally relaxing. She rubbed her temples, her face etched with weariness. "Well, Gretchen," she said, turning to face her sister, "that was something." Gretchen shrugged, trying for a nonchalant air. "Just another day at the academy, sis. I don't know how you stand it here. I didn't even last until graduation the first time." Cordelia's lips twitched. "You have a knack for stirring up trouble, don't you?" "Me? Never," Gretchen said, feigning innocence. "I'm just a humble potion maker, trying to make a living in this crazy world, and raising a young witch who's already talented enough to make enemies in high places." Cordelia's smile faded. "This prank of yours, with the sneezewort, Sabine's right. It was reckless, and it had consequences." Gretchen's smile faltered. She'd never considered how her youthful antics had caused collateral among her peers. Back then, it had all been a game. A way to thumb her nose at authority and inject a little chaos into the rigid structure of the academy. She'd never meant to hurt anyone. I didn't know," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "Of course you didn't," Cordelia said, her voice softening. "But it's important to understand that our actions, even though seemingly harmless, can have ripple effects. We have a responsibility to consider the consequences, not just for ourselves but for others. It was something you struggled to understand back then." Gretchen nodded, the words settling heavily in her stomach. She'd always been impulsive, acting on gut instinct and rarely thinking things through. It was a trait that had gotten her into more than a few scrapes over the years. But now, with Piper under her care, she couldn't afford to be so careless. "It feels a little unfair, you know? If she was good enough to get Lenora's attention, she might have ended up with that apprenticeship if it weren't for me." "Perhaps," Cordelia said as she sat in the stuffed armchair behind her desk, "and perhaps not. It is easier to blame others for your faults than to take responsibility for them yourself. And Sabine's actions with Piper's wand speaks volumes about her character. You might have been the worst kind of scamp as a pupil, Gretchen, but even I can admit that your intentions were never truly malicious. Foolish, certainly, but never that." Gretchen sank onto the chair across from her sister and sighed. "I've been called worse. But what about Piper? She shouldn't be punished over this." Cordelia's eyes narrowed. A month scrubbing cauldrons. For absconding and rifling through another student's belongings. "Aw, come on," Gretchen said. "In fairness, I did most of the rifling. A week." 2. Cordelia's lips pursed. "Fine," Gretchen sighed. "Aunt Esme always said scrubbing cauldrons built character." Cordelia's lip twitched. "Clearly, you have enough character to fill an entire volume, Gretchen." Gretchen laughed, feeling the tension in her shoulders drain. "On that we can probably agree." Epilogue. "My hands are raw, Gretchen. Scrubbing cauldrons is awful," Piper said, holding up her reddened hands for inspection. Gretchen, standing precariously on a stool, rummaged through a high shelf crammed with jars and bottles. "Told you those things built character, kid. Hold still. I've got something for that." Piper slumped by the counter, her face a mask of misery. Mulligan, oblivious to her plight, snored softly in a patch of sunlight, a rumbling purr vibrating through his purple fur. He stretched languidly, kneading the worn wooden countertop with his paws before settling back into his sun-drenched nap. "It's not fair," Piper muttered, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. 2 weeks. Miri only got 1 week, and she was using restricted potion ingredients. "Life ain't fair, kiddo," Gretchen said, hopping down from the stool, a small, dark green jar clutched in her hand. "Besides, you got off easy. Cordelia wanted to give you a month. Now, hold out your paws." Piper extended her hands, her nose twitching at the scent of chamomile and peppermint. Gretchen scooped a dollop of thick, green balm and gently massaged it into Piper's chapped skin. "There. That should do the trick. My own special blend. Soothes the skin, strengthens the nails, good for what ails you." Piper wiggled her fingers experimentally. "It already feels better," she said, a flicker of a smile crossing her face. "What's in it?" "A witch never reveals her secrets," Gretchen said with a wink. "But let's just say it involves a bit of this, a dash of that, and a whole lot of love." "Love?" Piper giggled. "That's not very scientific." "Science has its place," Gretchen said, tucking a wisp of hair behind her ear. "But magic is as much about intention as it is about measurements." "I guess so." "You guess so?" Gretchen scoffed playfully. "You've turned a cat into a chicken and back again. You've helped me brew serums that reveal hidden truths. You think that's textbook science?" Piper grinned, her earlier gloom forgotten. Okay, you've got a point." She flexed her hands again, the redness already fading. "Thanks, Gretchen." "Don't mention it, kid," Gretchen said, ruffling Piper's hair. "Now, what do you say we brew up a batch of my famous fire-breathing pepper potion? Just for fun." "Fire-breathing? Really?" A spark of mischief ignited in Piper's eyes. Really, Gretchen said, a matching glint in her own eyes. She rubbed her hands together, already envisioning the chaos that would undoubtedly ensue. Controlled chaos, of course. It's been a while since I brewed some, and... The jingle of the shop bell and the creak of the opening door caused Gretchen to snap her mouth shut in a mix of guilt and irritation. But before she could mutter about customers under her breath, a small figure bustled in. Wren, her brownie assistant, balanced laden baskets overflowing with herbs, roots, and other alchemical ingredients. His small, knobby hands strained under the weight, his brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't even spare a glance at Gretchen and Piper, his back to them as he struggled to lock the door behind him. "Honestly, Gretchen," Wren huffed, his voice a high-pitched chirp, "you wouldn't believe the prices Thistlewick is charging these days for mandrake root. Highway robbery, I tell you. But I managed to haggle him down a bit. Oh, and I told Lady Nadine that she would be better served by Sabine Mendel for the youth serum she ordered. Though I really cannot fathom why you would throw away the lady's business like." He finally turned, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "Oh, hello, Piper. Didn't see you there." Gretchen's blood ran cold. Wren had just inadvertently walked into a minefield. She shot him a silencing glare, her hand flying to her mouth in a frantic shush gesture. "You told Lady Nadine what?" Piper's voice was sharp, and her eyes narrowed. She crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on Gretchen. Gretchen winced. Of course it was too much to hope that she could keep that tidbit under wraps. "Wren," she said, forcing a smile through clenched teeth, "why don't you go put those ingredients out the back? We can discuss old man Thistlewick's exorbitant prices later." Wren, bless his oblivious little heart, only snorted. "Of course, Gretchen. Wouldn't want those glowworms to get into the nightshade again, now would we?" As soon as Wren was out of earshot, Piper turned to Gretchen, her expression stony. "Why would you send Wren to tell Lady Nadine that Mendel is a better alchemist?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. Gretchen groaned inwardly. This was not how she'd envisioned her afternoon going. "Look, kid," Gretchen said, her voice softer than she intended. "I scrubbed my share of cauldrons back in the day. Believe me, those blasted things do build character. Or at least some decent calluses which will put you in good stead in the potions business. But that was for harmless pranks. What happened to Mendel? That's different. Call it penance. But that whole mess with the chicken wand, it's on me." Piper's brow furrowed, her arms still crossed tightly. "But how is it your fault? Mistress Mendel made her choices out of spite." Gretchen sighed. You know, justice comes down to perspective, kid. Sure, it might seem black and white to you now, right and wrong. But as you get older, you'll see that it's all about as clear as a steaming bog. In her own head, what Mendel did was justified. But it wasn't. Gretchen shrugged. From your perspective, sure. But how is it fair that you've spent the past week scrubbing cauldrons while I've gotten off scot-free, huh? Well, Piper chewed her lip. I suppose Cordelia can't order you to do anything. You wouldn't listen, anyway. But Lenora Goldworthy might still cause trouble. Gretchen blew a raspberry. Like I care about her sort. No, Cordelia can't order me around. But I think she knows in her heart of hearts that I'd punish myself. Anyway, and sometimes the right choice is kindness, even if retaliation sounds more fun. But Lady Nadine, Piper said, her voice laced with confusion, she pays well. And she always asks for you specifically. Lady Nadine, Gretchen scoffed, is a stuffy blue blood who wouldn't know a real problem if it bit her on her perfectly powdered nose. She needs a youth serum. Please, let her and Mendel commiserate over their wrinkles. They deserve each other. Gretchen shuddered theatrically, causing Piper to smirk. The kid's arms remained folded over her chest, but her shoulders had loosened. Besides, Gretchen pressed, I'd take a working-class citizen with actual problems any day of the week. A farmer with a sick cow, a baker with a sore tooth, a blacksmith with sore joints. They're less fuss, and they're actually grateful for your work, which is as it should be. Piper raised an eyebrow, and Gretchen grasped her shoulders, a gentle smile gracing her lips. Look, kiddo, sometimes you need to throw a witch a bone, even when she doesn't deserve it. It's good for your soul. Fine, Piper sighed, and glanced at Mulligan on the counter. She reached to rub his belly and he startled. Gretchen leaned aside as her feline familiar sprang off the counter toward the back of the shop in a blur of purple fur, knocking over no fewer than 3 bottles on his way. A noxious steam hissed from the floorboards, and an undignified yelp caused them both to wince. That cat is a menace, Gretchen, Wren's voice shrilled. When his face poked around the door, covered in a film of orange powder, the sight of the steam halted the brownie in his tracks. Not the obsidian ooze. That'll be impossible to scrub off. Gretchen stood with her hands held up innocently, though the grin threatening to crack on her face spoiled the gesture. Wren went darting off presumably for cleaning supplies, and Piper doubled over with guilty silent laughter. Poor Wren, she managed when she straightened. Ah, forget it. Gretchen waved a hand. He's a brownie. That'll keep him busy for a week. He was almost salivating when he got back to find the mess we left last week. What about Mulligan? He usually likes a belly rub. Piper frowned as she looked toward the rafters, trying to spot him. He's a bit jumpy. To be expected, really. But honestly, I think the feather fiasco did him some good. He's certainly got a new lease on life, and I can tell you, he's used more than 9 lives already. He still tries to peck things occasionally, but that's no cause for concern. Not for the mice, anyway. Piper rubbed her chin, and Gretchen realized that the admission had caused more worry and not less. Perhaps he needs to see Harriet again. Maybe. Gretchen wrapped an arm around her ward's shoulder. But not today, kid. He'll be off in some alley poking at something questionable. Now, I believe we were rudely interrupted. The fire-breathing pepper potion. Let's see if I can get the spellbook to play nice today. Piper chuckled, and Gretchen let out a long breath. There were times for being serious, but she much preferred mischief. The innocent kind, of course. Thanks for listening to Fowl Play, the second story in Gretchen's new adventures. If you enjoyed this audiobook, consider subscribing to P.A. Mason's channel to make sure you keep up to date with new books as they're published. Until then, happy listening.